In the next 3 chapters, we're going to be learning the 3 final moods in Greek. In this chapter, we're going to be learning the subjunctive. In the next chapter, it'll be the infinitive. And the next chapter will be the imperative. And then we're done with moods. All right, congratulations. There's a couple of chapters on something called a me verb that we'll need to learn to close off the textbook. But we're getting near the end of the verbal system in Greek, so that's pretty good. All right. So in this chapter, we're going to tackle the subjunctive mood. What's the subjunctive mood? Well, let me start talking about the subjunctive in English. Back when we started learning verbs in chapters 15 and 16, I said that everything that you're going to be learning are going to be verbs in the indicative mood. And I didn't want to try to explain what the indicative mood was at that point, because it's really hard to describe what the indicative mood is unless you have something to compare it against. Okay, well, we're finally to a point now with the subjunctive that I can define the indicative mood. So let me do that, and then I'll talk about the subjunctive mood, and you can see them in contrast to each other. The indicative mood is defined as the mood of reality. In other words, if you want to say what is, then you put the verb into the indicative mood. So we use the indicative mood for declarative statements. We use the indicative mood for questions. Just if you want to state what is, the verb is in the indicative. Now remember, though, that language is just your portrayal of reality. Okay, just because you say something doesn't make it true, right? Okay, and so if you're going to lie in the indicative, right? But language is a portrayal of reality, and so the indicative mood is used to portray what is, okay? The subjunctive is the mood of possibility or probability. In other words, the subjunctive mood is the mood not to say what is, but what may or might be. Okay, that's in its most fundamental level. That's what the subjunctive mood is. You put a verb into the subjunctive mood when you want to state not what is, but what may or might be. For example, if you were to say, I will learn Hebrew. Okay, that's indicative, isn't it? It's your portrayal of reality. You're stating what is. This is your intention. I will learn Hebrew. If you were not quite sure you were going to learn Hebrew, you would shift into the subjunctive and you would say, I might learn Hebrew, or I may learn Hebrew. So you're not stating what is, but what may or might be. What is a possibility or a probability? One of the more common uses of the subjunctive in English and in Greek are conditional sentences, the if-then kind of sentences. So for example, you would say, using the subjunctive, if I were rich, I would hire a Greek tutor. Now, if in fact you were rich, then you would move into the indicative. You would say, well, I am rich, and so I will hire a Greek tutor. But you're probably a student and you're probably not rich. So you need to use the subjunctive, and you say, well, if I were rich, and that's subjunctive in English, if I were rich, then I would hire a Greek tutor. Okay, so the subjunctive is the mood of probability or possibility. It's the may or might idea in English. And the subjunctive is also used to describe an unfulfilled action. So most subjunctives are referencing actions that are going to occur in the future. All right. But that's the basic distinction between indicative and subjunctive, okay? All right, let's switch over into Greek now. And what we're going to see is that the subjunctive in Greek functions pretty much the same way as it does in English, except for one very, very important difference. Remember when we started to learn participles, I said that outside the indicative system, there's no absolute time. We saw with participles, there's relative time, but there's no real absolute time. But time was still kind of hanging around with participles. Okay, in these last 3 moods, there is absolutely no time significance, okay? It's completely and totally gone. When you see a verb in the subjunctive, the only thing it's telling you is, apart from the meaning of the word, of course, the only thing it's telling you is the action continuous or is the action undefined, okay? In the subjunctive, infinitive, and imperative, it's totally an issue of aspect, not an issue of time. And for that reason, for the most part, in biblical Greek, we only have present subjunctives and aorist subjunctives. Those are the only 2 aspects that really lasted in the subjunctive system. So the subjunctive that's built on the present tense stem of a verb indicates a continuous action, as you would expect. And the subjunctive built on the unaugmented aorist stem, again, as you would expect, is used to express an undefined action. Now, one of the nice little things about this is that there's no such thing as a future subjunctive. It was one of the blocks I had learning Greek. I remember still parsing verbal forms as future subjunctives. Well, there's no such thing as a future subjunctive. The aorist subjunctive, a first aorist subjunctive, will look like a future to you, but it's not. But all that you have to remember at this point is that the significance of the verbs in the subjunctive is only aspect, and so you have present subjunctives and aorist subjunctives, and therefore there's no such thing as a future subjunctive. You will never correctly parse a word as a future subjunctive, okay? All right. In terms of the formation of the subjunctive, let me just give you some general guidelines. The main sign of a subjunctive is the lengthened connecting vowel. The omicron will have lengthened to an omega, and the epsilon will have lengthened to an eta. So that's the sign of the subjunctive. It's a little tricky, though, because it's kind of hidden down inside the word, isn't it? It's tucked in there between the tense stem and the personal ending. Now, fortunately, there are other contextual clues that there's a subjunctive at work in a sentence, and I'll show you those in a second. But the only actual real indicator that you're in the subjunctive is this lengthened vowel. The other thing that's interesting in subjunctives is that both the present and the aorist use identical endings. They both use primary endings. And when you see them side by side, you'll see that, and you'll see why it's so important, again, to know your tense forms. Because when you want to compare a present to a second aorist subjunctive, they're identical. You just have to know whether the stem is a present stem or a second aorist stem. So, again, memory work becomes very, very important. In terms of translating subjunctives, initially all you really need to do is put a may or might into your translation, and certainly in your parsings just say may or might, I might loose, they may loose, that kind of stuff. There are other uses of the subjunctive where may and might are not appropriate, but to kind of get started, it's a good way to kind of remember the subjunctive. So use may and might. And the other thing on translations is this, the continuous aspect. It is really hard to bring the continuous aspect into your English translation. I mean, sometimes you can stick in a continually or something like that. I continually loose, but for the most part, you're simply not going to be able to explicitly translate the aspect of a continuous subjunctive. But you can in your preaching, and your teaching, and your Bible study, and everything else, but probably not in your translation. So, okay, well, that's the overview for the subjunctive. So let's jump into the actual paradigms, and you can see what they look like. The present, or as I like to call it, the continuous subjunctive, is formed with the present tense stem, lengthened connecting vowels, the omega or eta, and then primary personal endings. And so for the first person plural present active subjunctive, you would have luomen. See the omega? If you wanted to make it a third person singular present middle passive, you have luetai. Epsilon is lengthened to eta. The paradigm shows you not only the present active of luo, but also the present active subjunctive of me, and then the present active indicative of luo as well. But the subjunctive goes luo, lues, lue, luomen, lueta, luosi. You can see the first person singular is identical, and so when those happen, you'll find other contextual clues in the verse to help identify it as a subjunctive. And as far as Amy is concerned, it's just the connecting vowel and the personal ending with a smooth breathing and the circumflex. But anyway, there's the present or the continuous active subjunctive. Going to the middle passive, and again, everything is as you would expect. Luomai, lue, luetai, luometha, luestha, luontai. Second person singular is identical in the subjunctive and the indicative, but other than that, the long vowel will show you that you're in the subjunctive. Well, let's switch over to the aorist, or as I prefer to call it, the undefined subjunctive. It's formed with an unaugmented aorist tense stem, and then if it's a first aorist, you'll have a tense formative. But then you have the lengthened connecting vowel, either omega or eta, And again, just like in the present, you'll have primary endings. So, for example, the first person plural aorist active subjunctive is lusomen. If it were a middle, it would be lucetai in the third singular. This is an important paradigm, and you need to make sure it's really clear. It's the aorist active subjunctive. And you can see the endings are identical between the first aorist, which is the left column, and the second aorist, which is the right column. If it's a first aorist, you at least have the sigma, so there's some clue as to what's going on. But in the second aorist subjunctive, because it's unaugmented, you just have that root right there, lob, the second aorist tense stem. So you just got to rely on your memory work. And again, let me tell you, as you look at the first aorist column, there's no such thing as a future subjunctive. You can kind of see why you might think there is one, right? But there is no such thing as a future subjunctive. I should mention, too, that as far as contract verbs are concerned, remember that the lengthened vowel on the contract stem will be before the sigma, not after it. So don't confuse the long vowel before the sigma on a word like agapao with the long connecting vowel after the tense formative. Go into the middle subjunctive, and first and second aorist, or as you would expect. Again, the first aorist at least has a tense formative. And when you go into the passive, you can see that the eta of the tense formative has been swallowed up by the long connecting vowel. Lutho, luthes, luthe, luthomen, lutheta, luthosi. And when you look at the second aorist passive, don't be worried about these things again, because I'm going to show you that there's contextual clues. There are certain words or constructions that when you see them, that you'll start looking for a subjunctive. So when you see a graphe, for example, the third singular, you're not going to think it's a dative singular of some first declension noun. You'll be looking for a subjunctive, and you'll see that that is from graphel. So don't worry about that. The contextual clues are really helpful in the subjunctive. Well, that's it for the forms of the subjunctive. So let's move on to the meaning. And actually, there's four basic uses, four basic meanings of the subjunctive in the Greek. In other words, may and might are only one of several. So the first two of these uses of the subjunctive are in dependent clauses, and then the second two are in independent clauses. So let's take a look at them. The first use of the subjunctive is built around the word hina. And this is really, really important. When you see hina, start thinking subjunctive. Okay, this is actually more important than the lengthened connecting vowel in terms of you identifying it. I mean, the sign of the subjunctive is a lengthened connecting vowel. But when you're translating a sentence, it's the hina that's going to jump out at you and say, look, expect a subjunctive. There's a subjunctive coming. Now, there's a very few examples of the hina followed by an indicative verb in the New Testament. Almost always, it's going to be followed by a subjunctive. So that's a very, very important clue. And the use of hina with a subjunctive breaks down into one of two categories. And remember, when you memorize hina, you memorize it as meaning that or in order that. Okay, that's the twofold distinction I'm talking about. One of the functions of hina is to indicate purpose. And so what's going to happen is that you're going to have hina, and you're going to be in a purpose clause, and you'll be translating hina as in order that or so that or something like that. In order that, you see the hina and you start looking for a verb in the subjunctive, and that dependent clause is indicating the purpose of something. Take this as an example. You see what I mean? In Matthew 12:10, the verse reads that they asked him, ... so that, or in order that, there's that hina, start looking for a subjunctive. And I don't think you even know what the next verb is, but you can see it's a subjunctive, can't you? Because of that omega between the two sigmas. Yeah, they asked him these questions so that they could accuse him, in order that they might accuse him. So this questioning of Jesus was not because they wanted to get information, but the purpose of their questioning was that they wanted to get information in order that they could charge him, they could accuse him. Okay, so there you have hina, meaning in order that, and with the subjunctive it indicates purpose. But there's another category of hina with the subjunctive, and it has to do with certain verbs, and it's a very natural thing. That when you have verbs like I saw that, or I read that, or I heard that, then hina in the subjunctive is not so much indicating purpose as it's indicating the content of what I've heard or said or whatever. Okay, so there are certain verbs that end up using hina in a subjunctive to indicate content. So example, in Mark 6:12, we read that they preached ekeruksin hina that metanoiosin. Okay, there you see the hina, so you start looking for a subjunctive, and you go, in order that they might repent. Well, that could be it. Or they preached, and the content of their preaching was that they should repent. Okay, yeah, admittedly, those are pretty close, but yet they are different things. So you have hina with a subjunctive. That's the first use of a subjunctive, and it can be indicating purpose, or it can be indicating the content of something. All right? Okay. The second use of the subjunctive is with the word aeon. So just like you do with hina, the minute you see an aeon, if, you start looking for that subjunctive because it's going to be there. And where you find aeon in the subjunctive are in conditional sentences, in if-then constructions. And conditional sentences are simply saying that if this is true, then this is true. So there's an issue of conditionality. If this is true, then most certainly this is true. And the if clause is called the protasis, and the then clause is called the apodosis. So when you have aeon in a subjunctive, it's in the protasis, in the if clause of an if-then statement. Greek actually breaks their conditional sentences down into one of four categories. And aeon in the subjunctive is called a third-class conditional sentence. And we're going to look more at those in detail later, but we're just going to look at the aeon in the subjunctive in this particular chapter. Now, one of the neat things with aeon and the subjunctive is that there's actually two subcategories. And this may be a little too advanced right now, so if it is, check with your teacher to see if you need to know it or not. But it's kind of fun. When you see aeon on the subjunctive, it's going to be one of two things. And the aeon and the subjunctive aren't changing to tell you whether it's one or the other. It's an issue of context, okay? This is the distinction between a future more probable conditional sentence and a present general. Okay, now let me explain what those mean. First of all, the future more probable. A future more probable conditional sentence is envisioning a specific event in the future. And so Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount that if, there's your aeon, start looking for a subjunctive. Where is it? Agapeseta, right? Okay. So Jesus says, for if you love, then you have a substantival participle, right? For if you love those who are loving you, and it's a question, what reward do you have? So Jesus is telling the people that if in the future you love someone who loves you, then the point is, what point is it? Okay, so it's a future more probable. And the more probable means that the specific event that's being envisioned probably is going to be true. There's another conditional sentence that says the future event probably isn't true, but that's something else. Okay, but third class is future more probable if this is the case, and it probably is going to be the case, and this is true. So if you love those who love you, that's probably going to happen. Well, what reward is that for you? All right, future more probable. The other subcategory of aeon with a subjunctive, when it occurs in the protasis, is what's called a present general. And instead of thinking about a specific future event that may or might happen, the aeon and the subjunctive can be stating an axiomatic truth, a general truth. And again, the form isn't going to change. What's going to happen is you just have to look at the content of what's being said and say, okay, future, more probable, or is this axiomatic? It's a really nice distinction, and it makes it easier for you to teach and to preach these passages. But take this verse as an illustration. This comes out of John 11:9. And says, if, start looking for the subjunctive. Is it tis? No, tis is in the nominative and it's the noun. Peripate, there's that long eta. And see, if you weren't looking for a subjunctive, you might have missed that. You may think it's a dative singular or something. But because you see the aeon, you're looking for a subjunctive verb, and you'll find it. And so the verse says, if anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble. See, the verse isn't thinking about a specific event in the future, about someone walking here on a specific day. It's a general axiomatic truth. And so the verse is saying it as in a timeless way that if someone does walk in the day, he's not going to stumble. Okay? So that's your future more probable and your present condition. And it's kind of a fun way to divide up conditional sentences. Okay, those are the two uses of the subjunctive in dependent clauses, with hina and with aeon. Okay, let's move to independent constructions, constructions that can stand on their own. The third use of the subjunctive is in what is called a hortatory subjunctive. I don't know why we call it hortatory. I wish we called it an exhortation subjunctive or something. But a hortatory subjunctive is the form that a verb takes when you're making an exhortation, when you're exhorting someone to do something. And here's an example. There's a one-word sentence here. Prasuchomatha. Okay, this is from the verb prasuchomai, to pray, right? And so you come along and you see the prasucho. Oh, there's the omega, also subjunctive. We might pray. And it's kind of like, I didn't make any sense. Okay, well, here's what you typically find with the hortatory subjunctive. It's when the verb is first person, usually plural, and when it's generally at the beginning of a verse. That's where you find most of your hortatory subjunctive. So those are contextual clues. And the way we translate a hortatory subjunctive is we insert the phrase, let us when it's plural. So prasuchomatha is, let us pray. We're exhorting people to pray. Let us pray. This is one of the functions of the subjunctive. And again, it can't be an indicative. It's not stating what is, it's what you're exhorting someone to do or a group of people to do. So the next time you're sitting around the dinner table and you're getting ready to give thanks, say, prasuchomatha, and you'll so impress people with your facility with the Greek language. Well, whatever. Anyway, prasuchomatha, let us pray. All right. The fourth use of the subjunctive is called the deliberative subjunctive. And this is the use of subjunctive in questions. And there's specific kinds of questions. Deliberative subjunctive is used when the question is not answered with a simple yes, no. Deliberative subjunctives are used when the speaker wants the listener to mull over, to deliberate about the answer before answering, all right? This is one of my favorites from one of my favorite passages in the Bible, in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says, not therefore worry, saying, therefore do not worry, saying, and then you have three questions, and you can notice that every one of them is in the subjunctive. Te phagomen, what should we eat? Or te piomen, what should we drink? Or te peribalomatha, what should we wear? Okay, so there you have the four basic uses of the subjunctive. Subjunctive with hina, with aeon, and then the subjunctive used in exhortations and in deliberative questions. Okay, now before I kind of pull stuff together though, I want to say something about negations. Back when you started learning participles, I said that u is used to negate the indicative and may is used to negate the non-indicative. Now, when you see a may, it doesn't mean that a subjunctive is necessarily coming. It just means that a non-indicative form is coming, okay? But in that sense, the may becomes a clue that perhaps there's a subjunctive on its way. But there's something else about negations, and that has to do with double negations. When you have double negatives in English, they cancel each other out, right? In Greek, that's not the way it works. Double negatives strengthen each other. They make the negation even stronger. And as we're going to see in a couple of chapters, Greek actually has multiple ways to state prohibitions, and each one has its own nuances, and in fact, some yell no louder than others, all right? When you find me and an aorist subjunctive, it's Greek screaming no, all right? It's very, very emphatic. If you look at the exegetical insight for this chapter, you'll see a good illustration of it. So, me and an aorist subjunctive, they don't negate each other, but rather they are being emphatic in their negation, saying it stronger. Okay, having covered that, then let me kind of pull together at least the clues for the subjunctive. What are the clues that you're looking at a subjunctive verb? Well, contextually, the important clues are if you see hina or aeon or on, alpha nu. All three of those are going to indicate that in almost every case, a subjunctive is on its way. So those three words are just, you see them, you go, where's the subjunctive? It's almost like you want to put your finger down on them and start looking for the subjunctive so you don't get tricked by it. Okay, so contextually, that's the most important clue. Hina, aeon, or on are going to be followed by a subjunctive. Secondly, the subjunctive will have the lengthened connecting vowels. And then also there are two indicators that we've seen that at least you're outside of the indicative system, and that is the unaugmented aorist tense stem and may. Those are indications that you're outside of the indicative, perhaps a subjunctive, perhaps a participle, something else. Okay? So those are the clues. Now, before we conclude the chapter, I want to talk to you about questions. And this is one of my favorite little things in Greek because it's one of those things that we have constructions in English parallel to the constructions in Greek, but they're much more awkward in English. And so questions are often under-translated in English translations, especially English translations that are more concerned about the sound of the English and the flow, the more dynamic translations. In Greek, there's three ways to ask a question. Number one is you simply ask the question. Are you the king of the Jews? Okay, just ask the question. But in Greek, as in English, you can also ask a question in a certain way that tells the listener that you think the answer is going to be yes or no. All right? And here's how you do that in Greek. If you're asking a question and you want to indicate that you think the answer is going to be yes, then you put an oo in the front, the negation oo, in front of the sentence. A good illustration of this is the disciples are out in the storm in the boat, and Jesus is asleep. And the disciples say, "Teacher, do you not have a concern? Is it not of importance to you that we are perishing?" Now, when you look at that in English, I mean, you kind of like, that's a dumb question. I mean, it wasn't a very kind question, was it? Jesus, do you not care at all that we've been following you all this time and we're going to die? I mean, you can read it in English that way. But actually, this sentence has an oo at the beginning of the question. Do you not care that we are perishing? Is actually what the disciples are saying. See, the real conflict for the disciples is they believe that Jesus does care about them, and yet it appears to them that he's going to let them perish. And so they just don't say, do you not care that we are perishing? But they say, we think that you care that we're perishing. Is that true? Okay. Now, again, it's generally not going to come into English that way, but that's what the oo is doing it. And that's the second way to ask a question. That you ask a question in such a way that you show that the expected answer is yes. The third way is to ask the question in such a way that you think the answer is no. The best illustration of this is the series of questions at the end of 1 Corinthians 12, where Paul starts off by saying, "Are all apostles?" Well, when you read that, you know that not everyone is an apostle, so certainly the assumed answer is no. But as you get down further in the list, you may not be quite so sure what Paul thinks the answer is. But actually, Paul starts each of these questions with a may. And so he's explicitly stating that the expected answer to these questions is no. Well, in English, we would do it something like, all are not apostles, are they? ? See, you're still asking a question, but the form in which you are asking the question shows that you think the answer is going to be no. But anyway, those are the three ways to ask questions in Greek. Just to ask a neutral question, to ask it with an initial oo, which says you think the answer is going to be yes, and to ask the question with an initial may, the negation, which shows that you think that the answer is going to be no. All right? Okay. Now, I don't want to scare you at this point. There was a master verb chart that we learned in the indicative, and it was pretty long, wasn't it? It was a full page. Well, there's also a master non-indicative verb chart. It's not nearly as long or as difficult to learn. Okay, so I'm going to show it to you, but don't freak out. It's not that hard. But it is really important that you do learn this chart. So spend some time looking at it in the textbook. Make sure you understand how the present and the aorist subjunctive is put together. And it's pretty straightforward, and I don't think you're going to have a tremendous amount of difficulty with it. Okay, so there you go. That's it for the subjunctive. So let's review and summarize what we've learned so far. We learned that the subjunctive is the mood of possibility and probability. We'll use may or might in many of the translations, but it can also be used to express an exhortation, the let us idea. It can express a future, more probable condition. If something is going to be the case, and it probably is. It can also be used to express timeless axiomatic statements. And it can also be used to indicate that the question is not a yes-no, but should cause you to deliberate before you answer it. There is no time in the non-indicative system, especially in the subjunctive. So the only significance is really one of aspect, and the subjunctive built on the present tense stem indicates a continuous action, which you rarely will be able to bring into your translation. And the subjunctive formed on the unaugmented aorist stem is indicating an undefined action, which is what most of your translations will in fact be. You put a verb into the subjunctive by lengthening its connecting vowel, and then you use primary personal endings, and the same endings are used both in the present and in the aorist. As far as the signs of the subjunctive are concerned, whenever you see hina, aeon, or on, go looking for a subjunctive. Secondly, the subjunctive will have the lengthened connecting vowels. And thirdly, the signs that you are outside of the indicative system are the unaugmented aorist tense stem and may. They don't necessarily indicate it's a subjunctive, just that you're outside of the indicative system. So there you go. That's it for the subjunctive. There's only 2 words to learn in this chapter, so vocabulary is really easy. And have fun in the workbook. Lithos, lithu, ha. Stone. Toyutas, toyalte, toyutan. Such, of such a kind. In chapter 32, we're going to learn about the infinitive. So let's start with English. An infinitive is defined as a verbal noun. We already saw that participles are verbal adjectives, but infinitives are verbal nouns. And in English, we form them by taking the word to, and putting them with a verb. So to eat, to sleep, to pass, to fail. Those are all infinitives. Because an infinitive is a verbal noun, it can perform functions of a noun. For example, it could be the subject of a sentence. If you were going to say something like, to study Greek is my highest aspiration. To study is the infinitive. Greek is the direct object of the infinitive. And that whole phrase together, to study Greek, is in fact the subject of the verb, isn't it? To study Greek is my highest aspiration. So infinitives are verbal nouns, and even though they're formed with to and a verb, you can find them as subjects and direct objects and other things like that. And there is other ways in which infinitives can be used, though. They can, for example, complete the meaning of a verb. Some verbs just aren't complete in and of themselves. So you could say something like, I began. Well, I began what? Well, I began to sweat when the final exam began. Okay. I began to sweat. The infinitive, to sweat, is completing the sense of the verb. So anyway, in English, that's what an infinitive is. It's a verbal noun. When you move into Greek, you find the same thing, that Greek infinitives are verbal nouns. But one of the really nice things about Greek infinitives is that they are indeclinable. And that means that they have no person and no number. All right. Now, they will change the form based on tense. They will change the form based on voice. But they don't decline. They're indeclinable. Now, they are viewed as neuter singular. And why that's important is that often a Greek infinitive is going to be preceded with the article. And that article will always be neuter singular. But the article can be declined. The infinitive doesn't, but the article can. So let's say you had an infinitive that was functioning as the subject of the sentence. To review vocabulary is a good thing. Okay, to review is the infinitive, vocabulary is a direct object of the infinitive, but that whole phrase, to review vocabulary, is functioning as a subject, and therefore the article, while it's always going to be neuter singular, the case of it will be nominative because it's functioning as the subject of the sentence. So the infinitive itself is indeclinable, but it's viewed as singular neuter, and the article that often precedes it will be declined in terms of its case. It will always be neuter singular. All right. And as you saw from the illustrations, that infinitives can have modifiers like direct objects, to study Greek, to review vocabulary. Okay. But anyway, that's what infinitives are in Greek. Now, back when we looked at subjunctive, we saw that there were only two tenses because there was only two aspects in the subjunctive system, right? So the subjunctive built on the present tense stem is continuous. The subjunctive built on the unaugmented aorist tense stem is undefined. You may have been wondering about what about the perfect? Well, you're not going to have to worry about that when it comes to infinitive because all three aspects are representative in the infinitival system. So here's a chart that might help you keep all these things together. The infinitive that's built on the present tense system will indicate a continuous action, not time, just aspect. It'll indicate a continuous action. And in your translation, you may say something like to continually study. But again, as was true of subjunctives, it's really hard in English to bring the significance of the continuous infinitive into your translation. But you can use continually, at least for now, perhaps to help you get the idea of it. The infinitive built on the unaugmented, as you would expect, aorist tense stem is describing an undefined action, and we would use the simple to study as a translation. And the infinitive built on the perfect tense stem is indicating a completed action. And the best we can do at this point in English is to translate it with have, to have studied. So let's switch over to the infinitive morpheme chart. Now before we get into these different forms, recognize that all of the endings end in alpha iota except for the present active, which is then imitated by the second aorist active. If you start with just the present active form, the ain, then you're not going to see the consistency of these endings. And as normal, it's the present that's the problem. That's the pattern we've seen in Greek, isn't it? But all these endings, except for the present active infinitive, which is then copied by the second aorist, all end in alpha iota, so hopefully that will help you. And rather than trying to get more morphologically accurate in all this stuff, it's just easiest to memorize these 12 forms. Okay, so this is the chart you need to memorize. But the infinitive in the present tense system and the active is ain, and then in the middle passive it's esthai. In the first aorist, you will memorize it as psi. The sigma alpha is actually the tense formative, but go and just memorize it as psi. And then the first aorist middle, it's thosthai, and in the first aorist passive, it's thenai. So you can see the tense formative all the way through those three forms. Do you remember the second aorist in the participles? They borrowed the same on, usa, on that you have in the present, don't you? Same thing's happening in the infinitive. So the infinitive in the second aorist active is ain. In the second aorist middle, it's esthai. And then when you get into the passive, you do have the tense formative eta, and you have anai. Switch over to the perfect, and you have kenai. The kappa epsilon is the altered kappa alpha tense formative. And then in the perfect middle passive, you have the simple sthai. If you compare that to the present, you can see that probably the epsilon in esthai is a connecting vowel. So spend some time in these forms and see the consistency, see where they're the same, see where they're different, and then be sure you memorize this. Here's what they look like when you stick them onto a verb. And so spend some time in the chart and just go over and make sure it's all going to be clear. Again, you can see how the present and the second aorist are easily confusable if you haven't memorized your roots and stems accurately. But for the most part, these should be straightforward. And by the way, in translating, it's very simple. Just say to. So it's to loose or to be loosed in the present, to loose for oneself, I guess, in the middle, and to be loosed in the passive, to have loosed and to have been loosed in the perfect. Be sure you check out the paradigm in BBG of contract verbs and what they look like when they're infinitives. There's some weird contractions going on, so make sure you check that. And also notice that the infinitive of Amy is ani, epsilon iota, smooth breathing, circumflex, nu alpha iota. Just have to memorize that. Okay, that's it for the form of the infinitive. Let's move over to how you translate these things. Let me give you just some general clues. Obviously, the easiest way to translate an infinitive is just to put the word to in front of it. To eat, to sleep, that kind of stuff. That will get you out of most translational problems with infinitives. Okay, so just to plus the verb. Remember that we're outside of the indicative system, so there's no time significance. It's purely one of aspect, and so you have continual, undefined, and completed. But as we saw with subjunctives, so also in infinitives, it's really hard to get the continual nature of the continuous infinitive across in your translation. You might want to kind of artificially put the word continually in there, to continually study. But that's pretty awkward English, and so it'll be up to your preaching, teaching, and Bible study to convey the true notion of a continuous infinitive. When it comes to the completed infinitive, those formed on the perfect, you can use have. To have eaten generally conveys the significance in English. There is another thing generally, though, in translating infinitives, and that is the whole issue of the subject of the infinitive. Now, an infinitive is an infinite verbal form. Okay, are you familiar with what finite means? When we talk about a finite verb, we talk about a verb that's limited. That's what finite means. A finite verb is limited by its subject. Okay, so there's going to be masculine, feminine, neuter, perhaps, or singular, or plural, but a finite verb is limited by its subject. These are infinite constructions, so there can technically be no subject. And yet, often in Greek, you will find a word functioning as if it were the subject of the infinitive, much like the noun or pronoun in the genitive in a genitive absolute functions as if it were the subject of the participle. But you can have this, quote, subject of an infinitive. And in most cases, that subject is going to be in the accusative case. There are few verbs that when they are formed, when they're infinitives, that their subjects are going to be in the dative. But in the vast majority of cases, you can find a word in the accusative functioning as if it were the subject of the infinitive. So, for example, Jesus, the Bible says, he did not permit, and then you have your infinitive, to speak, and then ta daimonia, the demons. Well, the demons are in the accusative case. They're functioning as a subject of lalein. And so you have, he did not permit the demons to speak. Okay, so the word in the accusative is functioning as if it were the subject of the infinitive. All right. Just a couple of the quick odds and ends, and we're going to get into some more detailed stuff for how you translate these things. As you might expect, if you're going to negate an infinitive, you'll have may, okay, because we're outside the indicative system. In terms of parsing, there's only 5 things. You just say tense voice, and then in the mood slot, say infinitive. So it's an aorist passive infinitive from, and then give the lexical form, and then, too loose, or whatever the inflected meaning is. And in terms of deponent, remember that deponency is not an issue of mood, it's an issue of the tense voice. And so erchomai, for example, in the present infinitive is going to have a deponent form as well. All right, good. Okay, let's get into some specifics of how you translate infinitives. And there are 5 basic ways that infinitives are translated. Number 1 is that they're translated as a substantive. This is the easiest, most natural one. In other words, you'll come along and you'll see generally, not always, but generally the article and the infinitive, they're functioning as a noun, and you'll just put the word to in there and it will make sense. Paul says, for example, to me, and then tozein, and that's the infinitive of an alpha contract. That's why you need to look at the paradigms. For me to live, and then Christos is in the predicate. For me to live is Christ. All right? So that's the first way, as a substantive. The second way to translate an infinitive is as a complementary infinitive. And again, like in English, this is going to be you're going to find this when you're connected to certain kinds of verbs. And in fact, in Greek, there are 5 verbs that are always followed by a complementary infinitive. But these will be a very natural thing for you to translate. So for example, if you had he began, well, he began lalein. He began to speak. All right? So complementary infinitives, the infinitive is completing the meaning of the verb. So that's first and second. The third way to translate infinitives is a little more awkward because we don't have this construction at all in English. And so they're very idiomatic in how we translate them. And you basically, what you should do for these is make a separate vocabulary card. And you'll see why in a second. But this is the construction where you have a preposition plus an articular infinitive. So preposition, the article, and the infinitive. And these specific 6 forms have their own special meaning, okay? The first 3 combinations are all indicating reason or purpose, all right? And what you're going to see in these 3, and there are 3 different prepositions, is that you're going to have a preposition, then you're going to have an article, and the article in these 3 will always be accusative. And then you're going to have your infinitive, and you might have a not direct object, you might have another word in the accusative that's functioning as the subject of the infinitive. Let me give you the first example, and I'll show you. You may see something like this: dia ta blepein auton. Okay, here's how you remember it. Dia with an articular infinitive means because. Okay, that's your vocabulary card. Dia with an articular infinitive means because. So if you have dia ta blepein auton, you would translate that as because he sees. So you can't say to see because we just don't have this construction in English. So you have to translate the infinitive as a regular verb. And the auton is functioning as a subject, the infinitive in this example. So it is dia with the articular infinitive is because, and then he sees. Okay, so that's your vocabulary. Dia with the articular infinitive, backside it means because. Okay, the second preposition that's going to occur like this is ace. And ace is indicating purpose. And so you're going to say on your vocabulary card, ace with an articular infinitive, and flip it over, and it's going to say, in order that. So if you have ace ta blepein auton, it's in order that he sees. Okay? Okay, the third preposition that will occur like this is pros. And pros with the articular infinitive, again, means in order that. So if you have pros ta blepein auton, it's in order that he sees. Okay, so here are the first 3 of the 6 prepositions that occur with an articular infinitive and have a special meaning when you join them with the articular infinitive. Dia means because, and ace and pros both mean in order that. Okay? All right, so those are constructions that indicate reason or purpose. The other 3 prepositions that occur with the articular infinitive are all temporal, and they're going to mean before, when, and after. Okay, those are the 3. In fact, you might even be able to guess what prepositions I'm going to be talking about. Sometimes the articular infinitive occurs with pra. And when you have pra, the article will always be in the genitive, and the pra plus the articular infinitive means before. Okay? So if you have pra tu blepein auton, it's before he sees. Did you get that? Okay. The 5th, or the next preposition, is en. En will always be followed by the article in the dative, and it means when or while. So if you have en to blepein auton, it's when he sees. And the 6th and final is the preposition meta. Meta will always be followed by an article in the accusative, and it's going to mean after, and that one's really easy to remember. So if you have meta ta blepein auton, it's after he sees. Okay, so you have 6 new vocabulary cards, and each of these prepositions with the articular infinitive, and make sure that you memorize them as such. And by the way, on these articular infinitives, sometimes when I get really stuck, I have kind of an artificial thing that I do, but it gets me through the passage. I use the phrase the act of in connection with the infinitive, and then I say with reference to the word in the accusative. The act of with reference to. And so, for example, if I would see something like en to blepein auton, and I got stuck, I would say, I'd recognize what it is, and then I would say, okay, that means in the act of seeing with reference to him. Okay, how do I say that in English? Oh, when he sees. Okay, that's just something I do. It may not be helpful, but that's something that's gotten me out of some problems. Okay, so that was all the third use of the infinitive. It's the preposition plus the articular infinitive construction. 6 different ways that prepositions are going to be used. Okay, we have 2 more ways in which we're going to translate infinitives. The fourth is to indicate purpose. In other words, the infinitive is used to indicate purpose. And we've already seen one way in which the infinitive indicates purpose, haven't we? Yeah, if you have ace or pros with an articular infinitive, they are indicating purpose in order that. All right. The second way an infinitive can indicate purpose is when you simply have the article in the genitive in front of it. You'll have to, and then you'll have the infinitive form of the verb. In other words, if you saw tu blepein autus, make it plural, tu blepein autus, this would mean in order that they see. Okay, so you don't have to have the preposition in order to get the in order that idea. So you have an articular infinitive, but the article is going to be in the genitive, all right? The third way to indicate purpose is simply the infinitive all by itself. Now, this doesn't happen a whole lot, but it can. In other words, you could have blepein all by itself, and it could be translated in order to see. And what will happen in this case is that you'll see the blepein, and you'll go along and you'll translate and go, it doesn't make any sense. Oh, purpose fits this context. Okay. So 3 ways in which an infinitive is used to indicate purpose. Ace and pros with an articular infinitive, the article in the genitive with the infinitive, or the article simply all by itself. Okay? All right. Well, the 5th and final way in which infinitives are used is to indicate result. And this is when you have hosta, the omega with the rough breathing, sigma tau epsilon, when you have hosta with an infinitive. Now, what's awkward about this construction is we have nothing like it in English. And so we're going to have to take the infinitive and translate it as a regular verb. But when you see hosta followed by an infinitive, you know that the author is indicating result, okay? And so you have, for example, the verse that said, they filled up, both the boats were filled up, and then you have hosta, and then you have the infinitive buthidzistai, and auta. Okay, now auta is in the accusative, and that they're referring back to the ploion, back to the boats, with the result that to sink them, okay, with the result that they began to sink. Okay, it's how you have to do it. But again, because it's so idiomatic, you have to look at what it is grammatically in Greek and then ask yourself, how do I say the same thing in English, okay? So those are the 5 uses of the infinitive in Greek. So that's pretty good. Well, let's get into our summary. We learned that an infinitive is an indeclinable neuter verbal noun that will often be preceded by the article, and that article will likewise be neuter singular, but it will change its case depending upon how the infinitive is functioning in the sentence. We learned the infinitive morpheme chart. So in the present, the infinitive is ein and esthai, first aorist, psi, sasthai, thenai, second aorist, ein, esthai, enai, and in the perfect, kenai, sthai, sthai. In terms of translating infinitives in very general terms, you just put a to in front of it. There's no time significant, only aspect. The continuous aspect is hard to come into English, but the undefined and the perfect, in which case you use have, is pretty straightforward. And there often will be a word in the accusative that's acting as if it were the subject of the infinitive. In terms of specific translation, we saw 5 ways in which we will be translating the infinitive. They function as a substantive, often as an articular infinitive in this case. The infinitive can be a complementary infinitive. And we saw that there are 6 prepositions which, when joined with an articular infinitive, have a very specific meaning. Dia will mean because, eis and pros will mean in order that, pra will mean before, en will mean when or while, and meta will mean after. We saw that an infinitive is used to indicate purpose, and it'll either be eis or pros with the articular infinitive, or just the simple article with the infinitive, in which case the article is going to be genitive, or the infinitive by itself can indicate purpose. And fifth and finally, we saw that hosta plus an infinitive can indicate result. Because we don't have this construction in English at all, you're going to have to translate the infinitive not with the to word, but as a regular verb. Okay, that's it for the infinitive. Very good. You may want to take a look at the discussion in the advanced information about indirect discourse. It probably is too advanced for first year, but you may find it interesting. So have a good time with your vocabulary and your workbook. Dikaios, dikaia, dikaion. Right, just, righteous. Mellow, I am about to. In chapter 33, we're going to be learning the last mood. We're going to be looking at the imperative mood. So this is really a watershed chapter for you. So when you're done with it, you're going to be done with all the moods that you have to know. Congratulations. There are 3 more chapters. We're going to learn something called me verbs, but that's more an issue of form than meaning. So in terms of the meaning of the Greek verbal system, this is it. So congratulations. In English, the imperative is very straightforward. It's the form of the verb we use to state a command. And all imperatives in English are second person, either singular or plural. So if I said look, there's an assumed you look or y'all look, but they're all second person. That's pretty much it for English imperatives, okay? When you go into Greek, there's a lot of overlap, as there's been on many of these moods. But there's a few things that are different. The most conspicuous difference is going to be that in Greek, you have both second and third person imperatives. Now, there's nothing like a third person imperative in English, so when you come to translate third person Greek imperatives, you're going to have to be idiomatic. And what we do is we use the word let and then a pronoun. At least that's a way to get the idea across. For example, if you saw the form blepeto, that's a third person singular imperative, obviously a blepo, and you would translate that as let him look. Now contextually, when you're actually translating a paragraph, there may be a better way to do it, but for now, we'll use let and a pronoun. So blepeto is let him look. So there's third person forms of the Greek imperative. In terms of aspect, again, you probably would assume that there's no time significance at all in the Greek imperative. It's only an issue of aspect. And so the Greek imperative built on the present tense stem of a verb indicates a continuous action, and the imperative built on an unaugmented aorist tense stem indicates an undefined action. There actually, technically, I should say, there is a perfect imperative, but it only occurs 4 times in the New Testament. I've listed them in the advanced information, so we can focus on the present and on the aorist imperatives, and it's good for biblical Greek. Let's look at how you actually form the imperatives. The present, or as I prefer to call it, the continuous imperative, is formed very simply. You have a present tense stem, a connecting vowel, and then an imperative morpheme. Yes, there's one last set of morphemes you're going to have to learn, but there's not many to them, so it's not a big deal. So lueto means let him loose, and the to is a third person singular imperative morpheme being used there. You switch over to the aorist, or as I prefer to call it, the undefined imperative, and this is technically a first aorist, I should say. You form it with an unaugmented aorist tense stem, the tense formative, it'll be sa, and then the appropriate imperatival morpheme. So lusato means let him loose. You're going to find that trying to move between the present and the aorist imperatives in your translation is almost impossible. It's going to be really hard to bring out the continual aspect of the present imperative. And so the translations are given the same for the present and the aorist. So lusato means let him loose. Well, here's the imperatival morpheme chart. Okay, this is the last morpheme chart that you're going to have to learn. And let me talk just a little bit about it before we get to the endings. You have second and third person singular, second and third person plural. And then in the middle column, you're going to have active and aorist passive. Now, you've seen this kind of thing happen in participles, haven't you? Where the aorist passive is using an active form, an active morpheme. Okay, the same thing is happening with the imperative. You have the active morpheme, which is going to be used in the aorist passive. Okay, and then the other column is the middle passive morphemes. Now, you notice in the second person singular I have question marks. That's because I wasn't able to reduce the second person singular forms to the chart. They're all regular, but there's a lot of changes happening in them. And so, unfortunately, what you're going to do is not only memorize the chart, but you're going to actually have to memorize the second person singular form of the imperative in each of the different tense and voice combinations, okay? I'm sorry I couldn't get it in a chart. Again, if you think of one, let me know. But for right now, what you're going to memorize is this chart and then the second person singular forms, okay? So we go to the imperatival morpheme chart, and going down the active, the forms you'll memorize are something, which is what the question mark stands for, and then to, te, tosin. Okay, the third singular and the plural are very regular, the to, te, tosin. You flip over to the middle passive, and you have pretty much the same thing. You have something in the second person singular, and then in the other forms, it's stos, thes, thosin. In other words, the tau is being replaced with a sigma theta. So, in a very real sense, if you know the active forms, that's all you really need. Something, to, te, tosin. Then you go in the middle passive, and it's something, stos, thes, thosin. All right, so that's the imperatival morpheme chart that you have to learn. Let's look at the actual paradigms, and you'll see how these things all work out. For the active imperative, you have in this chart, you have the present and then the aorist and then the definition. You have to simply memorize that lua is the second person singular form of the imperative in the present. Lua means loose, for use singular. But then after that, it's regular. Lueto, luete, luetosin. And then the aorist, you memorize luson. And then after that, it's regular. Lusato, lusate, lusatosin. The one form that's a little confusing is the second person plural of the present imperative, luete. Looks just like the indicative, doesn't it? Well, it's because it is the same consonants and vowels as the indicative, luete. And this is kind of becomes a problem in some exegetical issues. For example, in Mark 11:22, the text reads, ekete pistin theou. And if ekete is an indicative, Jesus is saying, you have faith in God. But if it's an imperative, he's telling the people, have faith in God. Well, it's kind of an important difference, isn't it? So this second person plural form can be a bit of a problem in terms of exegesis, but you'll look at the context and you'll make up your mind. It's okay. All right, so that's the active imperative. Let's switch to the middle imperative. And you can see, again, you need to memorize the second person singular, which is luu in the present. But then after that, it's regular. Luesto, lueste, luestosin. And in the aorist, you have lusai, lusasto, lusaste, lusastosin. And they mean you loose, let him loose, and so forth and so on. Pretty straightforward. As far as the definitions are concerned, if you wanted to bring out the middle, I guess you would say, you loose for yourself, let him loose for himself, that kind of stuff. But it's so obviously horrible English, you probably won't say that in your translations. The two forms that are going to give you trouble, though, in this paradigm are the second person singular. The luu kind of looks like a second person singular imperfect middle passive, doesn't it? But the imperfect will have an augment, so that'll be okay. And then over in the aorist, lusai kind of looks like an infinitive, the psi ending. But this is the imperative of it. But other than that, it's pretty straightforward. Switch over to the passive imperative. And again, you know the present passive, because same as the middle, luu and so forth. And in the aorist passive, you memorize lutheti. But after that, lutheto, lutheta, luthetosin. Here's the second aorist imperative. And again, as you would expect, it's going to look just like the present, but you're going to have an unaugmented second aorist stem. You just got to know your stems, don't you? I hope you're not tired of me saying that by now. But you have to know your roots and your stems to handle Greek in the second aorist. But labe is the second person singular, so it's receive, and then labeto, let him receive, and so forth and so on. And then you have the middle and the passive forms of ginomai and grapho there. Let me close off imperatives with just a few odds and ends. Be sure you check the paradigms out for contract verbs and AME in BBG. When contract verbs go into the imperative, there's some kind of odd contractions that happen, so you want to make sure that you'll identify them in context. And the imperative forms of AME are very straightforward, so make sure you look at that. In terms of parsing imperatives, my recommendation is tense, voice, mood, which is imperative, and then person and number. So blepeto is going to be a present active imperative, third person singular from blepo, meaning let him see. All right? Okay. In terms of meaning with imperatives, they're very straightforward. They're the mood of command, so you'll translate them as a command. But there's one interesting situation you have in biblical Greek, and that is, how do you call on God to do something? Well, in Greek, you actually use the imperative form of the verb. But rightly so, grammarians are a little uncomfortable saying we command God. And so they created a category called the imperative of entreaty. We're entreating God to act. So the actual form of the verb is an imperative, but we're going to call it an entreaty, not a command, okay? So when the disciples say to Jesus, Lord, teach us to pray. Well, they're not telling him what to do. That wouldn't be appropriate, but they are asking. The form of the verb, teach, is an imperative, but we categorize it as an imperative. Now, there's a great example of imperatives of entreaty, and that's the Lord's Prayer. And this is one of my soapboxes, so let me rant and rave for just a little bit. I have real trouble with most modern translations of the Lord's Prayer because the way they state it, your kingdom come, your will be done, it feels so passive. At least it does to me, and I think it does to most people. Did you know that the verbal forms all the way through the Lord's Prayer are imperatives? They're commands. They're entreating God to act. They are calling on God to act. The Lord's Prayer is a powerfully active thing, and I don't think most people know that. When they say, hallowed be your name, it's a, may your name be hallowed. In other words, may you act in and through me in such a way that people can see you, God, for who you truly are, that you are holy. Your kingdom come. May your kingdom come. God, may you act in and through me in such a way that your kingdom comes. God, I'm calling on you that your will be done here on earth as it is in heaven. I mean, the Lord's Prayer they're all imperatives. They're all entreaties, and they're calling on God to act. And I just think they should be translated that way. Okay, so much for my soapbox. But in terms of the meaning of imperatives, they are the mood of command, and when they're addressed to God, we call them entreaties. Actually, when you are addressing anyone your superior, then we call them entreaties. In terms of aspect, there is, again, no time in the imperative system, and it's going to be really hard to get the continuous nature of the present imperative into your translation. You can use words like continue or keep on or something like that, but for the most part, you're going to translate a present and an aorist imperative the same way, and it'll be up to your preaching and teaching to convey the significance. Okay, that's it for the imperative, so congratulations on getting to that point. But there is one more thing I want to share with you, and that's the whole issue of prohibitions. This may have been a topic that belonged in the advanced information, but I really like prohibitions. Remember why you learned Greek? You do remember why you're learning Greek, right? It's because you wanted to get at the very words of God for the Greek Testament. You wanted to be able to understand the nuances of the original language and not rely on translations. Well, prohibitions are one of those things that have really neat nuances tucked away inside of them that can't come through in your English translation. I mean, it's almost impossible in translation to convey the nuances of the prohibitions. There are basically 5 different ways to state a prohibition in Greek. There's technically 6, but 5 basic ways, and each one has its own little nuance. So this is your golden nugget of Greek, okay? This is one of those reasons why you learn Greek. So let me cover the prohibitions. The first way to state a prohibition is to use "u" and the future indicative. Thou shalt not covet. Okay, that's the real vanilla way to state a prohibition. Nothing special there. Okay. The second way to state a prohibition, though, is to use "may" with a present imperative. And when you use "may" and a present imperative, you are prohibiting an action whose aspect is continuous, who's continual. Okay, so you're prohibiting an ongoing action. Now, and this is exegetically a really important point. About 20, 30 years ago, I'm not sure when, but somewhere back then, we grew in our understanding of prohibitions. In earlier days, we were taught that if you have a sentence that has "may" with a present imperative, what the prohibition is doing is prohibiting an action that is already happening. In other words, whenever you had the "may" plus present imperative, by definition, the action was occurring and you were telling it to stop. What we learned several decades ago was that's simply not the case. There was reasons that people had, that scholars had for believing that, but if you pick up any current Greek grammar of Koine Greek, you're going to see that we understand that's not what's going on. The "may" plus the present imperative is used to prohibit an action that is continual in its aspect. This is really important exegetically and why I'm pointing it out. For example, in the pastorals, when Paul is writing to Timothy, he uses "may" and a present imperative to say, these things shouldn't be done, about sinning or whatnot. And if "may" plus a present imperative is negating an action that's already occurring, then you have a really bad view of Timothy, because it means he is sinning and he's being told not to. All right? But that's not what "may" with a present imperative is doing. It's not prohibiting an action that's already occurring. And Timothy wasn't living in sin in the pastorals. And check my commentary on that one. But "may" plus the present imperative is simply prohibiting an action that is continual in its aspect. Okay? The third way to state a prohibition is "may" with an aorist imperative. And "may" with an aorist imperative is prohibiting an action that is undefined. Okay? Now we have to do some unlearning here in some of the older commentaries as well. Because in decades back, it was taught that if you had "may" with an aorist imperative, the author was saying, don't even start. All right? Now, if you want to state a prohibition and you want to say don't even start doing something, you probably would use "may" with an aorist imperative, but that's not what that construction means. "A" with an aorist imperative simply is a prohibition of an undefined action. It's not telling you whether you should not start or not stop or any of that stuff, okay? So again, you're going to see this in some of the older commentaries and actually in some of the newer commentaries too. But any current Greek grammar will clear that up for you, okay? All right, that's the first three ways in which we state a prohibition. The fourth way to state a prohibition is "may" with an aorist subjunctive. Okay, when you have "may" with an aorist subjunctive, the nuance is it's just a little stronger. The prohibition is just a little stronger. And to be fair, there are some people that debate this point, that they see "u" in the future indicative and "may" in an aorist subjunctive as having the same force. But I think probably it has just a little more negation, a little more force in it. For example, Jesus says, don't think that I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. Just a little bit stronger. Don't think that way. All right. The fifth way to state a prohibition, though there is no controversy, and that is when you have the two negations, "u," "may," and the aorist subjunctive form of the verb. That is the strongest way to state a prohibition. And it's not screaming, but it's pretty close to it. It's saying, don't do it. All right. Jesus uses this construction to say, my words will never pass away. And when you have "u," "may" and an aorist subjunctive, because we don't have that kind of prohibition in English, the translators struggle with how to convey the strength of it. Sometimes they'll put the word "never" in there, and sometimes "never" is appropriate, but it's appropriate contextually. We know that Jesus' words never will pass away. Sometimes "never" is a little too much, though. I mean, you can state a prohibition really strongly, knowing things are going to change in a year or something. But sometimes "never" is a little too much. But "u," "may," and an aorist subjunctive is a way to forcefully state a prohibition. And it's really important when you see that to convey that sense in your preaching and teaching. Well, let's move on to the summary and see what we've learned in this chapter. We've learned that the imperative form of the verb is used to express a command or make an entreaty to God. We saw the Greek imperative can occur in the second and third person, and when it's third person, we generally say something like let plus the pronoun. In terms of aspect, it's very hard to bring the continuous nature of the present imperative over into English. You rarely can do it. And we learned our final chart, our imperative morpheme chart. In the active and the aorist passive, it's something, to, te, tosin. And in the middle passive, it's something, sthos, thes, thosin. And we saw the 5 or 6 ways to state a prohibition in Greek. U with the future indicative is the vanilla prohibition. May with the present imperative is a prohibition of something that's continual in nature. May with the aorist imperative is a prohibition of something that's undefined in its nature. May with the aorist subjunctive is a little stronger way to state a prohibition, possibly. And ume with an aorist subjunctive is a very strong way to state a prohibition. But the strongest prohibition is may with the optative, me genoita, God forbid. Well, there you have it. You're done with chapter 33. You're done with the imperative, and you're done with all the moods. And so we just had those 3 chapters on me verbs to go. Congratulations. Apollomy. In the active, I destroy, kill. In the middle, I perish, die. Apoluo. I release. Ete. If, whether. In these last 3 chapters of BBG, we're going to be learning something called me verbs. Our paradigmatic verb is ditto me. It means I give. And you can see from the first person singular form that it ends in mu iota. Hence we call it me verbs. So what we're going to do in this chapter, we're going to learn the indicative of ditto me. In the next chapter, we're going to learn the non-indicative. And then the final chapter, we're going to talk about some other parts of the me verb system. All right. So with that, we'll be done with BBG. So good job. So far, all the verbs that we've been learning fit into a category called the thematic conjugation. By thematic, we mean that these verbs all use connecting vowels, okay? Or another way to say it is the first person singular of these words all end in omega or amai, okay? But all these verbs use they're part of the thematic conjugation, which means they have a theme vowel, or what we've called the connecting vowel. Me verbs belong to an entirely different conjugation called the athematic conjugation. Now, the A in athematic is from the Greek alpha privative. It's the way you negate something in Greek, kind of like you do with un or ear in English. So the athematic conjugation is the conjugation of verbs that don't use a thematic vowel. Now, don't go screaming into the night. It's not like we have to do, we have a ton more to learn, okay? While we have 2 different conjugations, there's a tremendous amount of overlap, except in the present, okay? That's where the differences are. So it is a different conjugation called the athematic conjugation, and these are verbs that all end in mu iota in their lexical form, all right? Now, you already know a me verb, don't you? What is it? Yeah, it's a me, yeah. A me is a me verb. And I didn't want to talk about thematic and athematic conjugations back when we learned a me, so I just kind of skipped over it. But a me is an example of a me verb. Okay, so there's thematic conjugations, those verbs that use theme vowels or connecting vowels, and their lexical forms end in omega or amai. And then you have athematic conjugation, which are verbs that don't use a theme or a connecting vowel, and their lexical forms in mu iota. All right. Now, I have good news and I have bad news about me verbs. Let's start with the bad first. The me verbs are really different in the present active, okay? The differences don't extend that much into the other forms of the verbs, but they're really different in the present active, and they're very, very common. Okay, the me verbs, most of the me verbs occur, I should say some of the me verbs occur a lot, okay? That's the bad news. The good news is that, first of all, me verbs have a different way to form their first person singular, second person plural, kind of. They're different inflected forms. We're not dealing with issues of meaning. It doesn't matter whether a verb is a me verb or a thematic verb. It only affects the form, but doesn't affect the meaning. But on the good side as well is that there are very few me verbs. Now, those few me verbs occur a lot, but there's not a whole lot of them. And the whole key on the me verb system is to know the roots. Now, there's several other things I'm going to be showing you. But again, if you've been learning your roots along with your stems, the true personal endings, me verbs are not going to be very difficult for you, okay? So good news and bad news all wrapped up there together. Now, as usual, there's two ways to learn all these things. One is that you can memorize all the paradigms, and I think there's about 330 forms that a me verb can occur in. Now, the New Testament doesn't show most of those forms, but there are a total of 330, and you can memorize it if you want. I don't know of hardly anyone that actually knows the paradigms. All right? They learn the rules. And so what I'm going to teach you is not to memorize the paradigms, but I'm going to teach you 5 basic rules. And if you know the root of the me verb and you know these 5 basic rules, you're going to be able to figure out the me verb system relatively simple. There are actually 4 classes of me verbs. It's kind of like the 3 classes of contract verbs. There is the Omicron class, didomi. The rooted didomi is da, so it's an O class or an Omicron class of me verb. And like I said, in this chapter, we'll be learning the indicative of that. In the next chapter, we'll be learning the non-indicative. But then the other 3 classes are me verbs whose roots end in an alpha, who end in an epsilon, and end in an upsilon. And just like once you kind of know one of the contract verbs, you can kind of figure out what's happening in the other contract verbs. The same thing is true in me verbs. Once you see what's going on with didomi, then that same information is going to ripple down all the other paradigms. So we're going to really focus on didomi, make sure that you learn it really well, and then by implication, you'll see how all the other me verbs work. Okay. Now, before we jump into the rules, though, I would like to call on your powers of observation, let's say, okay? And I just want to show you some me verbs, and I want to kind of talk the way through, and I'll have to help you on some of it, but I just kind of want to just talk our way through it, and I think you'll start seeing you're going to see the rules is what's going to happen, but I want you to figure them out for yourself, okay? So let's start with the form didomi. It comes from the root da, delta omicron, and the first person singular, present active indicative is didomi. Now, don't tell me what you don't know, tell me what you do know, okay? Where does the root da show up in didomi? Well, there's no delta omicron anywhere, but you already know that vowels can change their length, right? That's oblong. So omicron, if it were going to change, it would change to an omega. So where's the root in didomi? Well, it's do, isn't it? The delta omega. The final vowel of the root is lengthened. Why? I'll tell you in a second, but it's not overly important. There's the root. Okay. So if do is the root, what else can you tell me? What's that delta iota doing in front of it? Well, what does the delta iota look like to you? It looks like reduplication, doesn't it? In the perfect, we have the reduplication of the initial consonant, and the 2 consonants are separated by an epsilon. Here it looks like they're separated by an iota. Now, okay, you may not have guessed that, but that's exactly what's going on. In the present active of me verbs, that initial consonant is going to duplicate, and it's going to be separated with an iota. So you have the root, da, it's gone to do in the present tense stem. You've had reduplication with an iota. Now, what else can you tell me? Well, you look at the me ending, and again, you know it from a me, but it's not a normal ending, isn't it? Well, the rule is that in the present active of me verbs, there are 3 alternate endings. First person singular is one of them. Okay, now, you may not have been able to guess that, but having said that, look at that. One, you can see the importance of knowing your roots, can't you? So the root's da with an omicron. It goes to do. There's reduplication and an alternate ending, and you have didomi. All right, take a look at the full chart here, and you can kind of see what's going on in me verbs. And again, as you look at the chart, don't memorize this at this point, but just kind of look down and look for things that are familiar, okay? If you go down the present column, the left-hand column, you have didomi, didos, then you have didosi. Well, that's sigmiota. That's different there, isn't it? Well, it's another alternate ending. You go into the plural and you have didamin. What happened there? The omega went back to the short omicron from the root, didn't it? But it's the same word. Didate didoasi. What's different in didoasi? Well, the asi is an alternate ending. But you've already seen that ending, haven't you? Where have you seen it? Well, you've seen it in the perfect. The asi ending, it comes with a tense formative, it's kasi. But you're already used to seeing asi, alpha sigma iota, as a third plural ending. Okay, switch over to the aorist then. What do you have? Well, it's edoka. It's kind of weird. Well, not really. You have the da has lengthened to do. You have your augment. What's weird is that there's kappa, right? Well, there's a whole category of verbs in Greek that are called kappa aorist. In the aorist, they don't use sa, they use ka. And me verbs are kappa aorist for the most part. Now, once you figure that out, the rest is pretty straightforward, isn't it? No big surprises. But you go, wait a minute, if kappa alpha is in the aorist, how am I going to tell the difference between an aorist and a perfect? Well, there's reduplication in the perfect, right? And so you have dedoka. You have the do, there's your stem, reduplication with your normal epsilon. So the reduplication in the present is with an iota. Reduplication in the perfect is with an epsilon, as you would expect, and everything else is perfectly normal. Now, take a look at that chart for just a bit and kind of look around. And again, don't look at what's different, but look at what's the same. Okay, you have the reduplication of the present, different endings, vowel changing its length, kappa in the aorist. Okay, that's quite a bit. I'll grant you that. But other than that, it's pretty straightforward, isn't it? Okay, that was just, I wanted you just to look at them that way and kind of turn on your educated common sense in Greek and work through it. And I think you'll see that it's not as difficult as perhaps at first glance it might be. I mean, when you first see that the da is didomi, it's going to look in the present, it's going to go, that's so weird. But the weirdness belongs in the present and in a very real sense in the present active, all right? And everything else is going to be perfectly regular. Okay, let's go through the rules. There are 5 rules that I'm going to want you to learn. And if you know the root of the me verb and you know these 5 rules, me verbs are very straightforward. Here's the first rule. The me verbs reduplicate their initial stem letter to form the present, and by implication the imperfect, and then they separate the reduplicated consonant with an iota. So to use the example I had before, you have the root da is going to go to did da, and then the omicron is going to lengthen to omega, did o, and then you add the alternate ending and you have didomi. Okay, so that's rule 1. But understand this is only in the present. Okay, if you look at what happens to didomi in the future, it's perfectly regular. You have the root da, and it's going to lengthen to an omega, and then you add the sigma and the normal endings, and you end up with doso. Okay, that's no big deal. In the perfect, you have da being reduplicated to dead da, and you have dedoka. Okay, so this reduplication with an iota is only in the present tense, okay? And by implication, therefore, the imperfect. It's not in the other one. So it's the present that's the weird one in these things, all right? So again, take a look at the chart and spend some time just going down there. You can see the di is in the present active, and it will be in the present middle passive as well. But other than that, it's perfectly regular in a sense, in the aorist and the perfect. Well, at least I say it's perfectly regular in that there's no reduplication with an iota anywhere else, okay? That's just in the present. Okay, very good. Okay, rule 2. Rule 2 is that me verbs do not ordinarily use a connecting or a thematic vowel in the present indicative. And one of the reasons for that is that these roots end in vowels. They don't need an extra connecting vowel put in there, okay? So if you have the form didamin, okay, you have the da, it reduplicates the did da, and you don't need to stick any other vowel in there, so you put the men right on it, and you have didamin, okay? All right, piece of cake. That's rule 2. Rule 3, the me verbs employ 3 different personal endings in the present active indicative. Again, it's really important that you see it's present active. These alternate endings don't occur anywhere else. They don't occur in the present middle passive. They don't occur in the future or the aorist or the perfect, okay? The alternate endings, the three alternate endings, are only in the present active. Okay, take a look at the paradigm. And you'll see that the endings that are new are the me in first singular, the si, sigma iota, in third singular, and the asi, which isn't that new, in the third plural. So it's dido me, didos, didosi, didamin, didate, didoasi. If you compare them over to the luo, you can see how in the second person singular and the first and second person plural, we have the same endings that we have in the thematic conjugation. But when you switch over into the present middle passive, there's no big deal, okay? You still have the reduplication with the iota, but you have the mai, sai, tai, mythos, tai. And again, you'll notice that this is one of those few occasions where in the second person singular, the sigma doesn't drop off and you see the true ending, sai. But you've been learning the true ending, so that's not a big deal, is it? There's nothing new there for you to learn. Okay, very good. Okay, rule number 4 is that the stem vowel of me verbs can lengthen, shorten, or drop out. It's just another example of ablaut. And so, for example, in the first person singular, you have didomi with an omega, and then you go into the plural, it's didamen with an omicron. Now, you need to check with your teacher on this point, because I've never required my students to memorize when the vowel is going to be long or short. When I see the root da, I think delta O class vowel, and frankly, I don't care whether it's an omicron or an omega. I see them as interchangeable because it's just ablaut doing its job. And so it doesn't really matter to me whether it's an omicron or an omega. But check with your teacher as to whether you need to memorize when it's going to be long and when it's going to be short. And here's an example of why. If you saw a form doso, what would it be? Delta, omega, sigma, omega. Well, it's the root, and it's been lengthened, and you have a sigma and a primary active ending. It's got to be a first-person singular future active indicative, right? Yeah, nothing else. But what if you saw the form doso with an omicron? What would that be? Well, it could only be a first-person singular future active indicative. It couldn't be anything else, right? In other words, it doesn't matter whether, in terms of parsing, it doesn't matter whether that stem vowel is long or short. You're going to be able to figure out what it is. But there probably is some value in memorizing the variation, but you're going to have your teacher tell you what to do at that point, okay? All right. Rule number 5, our last rule, okay? Rule number 5 is that most of the me verbs use kappa alpha as their tense formative in the aorist. Now, there are kappa aorists that aren't me verbs, but me verbs, for the most part, are kappa aorists. And so that's just another rule you have to learn. So take a look here at the full paradigm. And this is one of those paradigms where you really just need to get your book out and stare at it for a while. And take these 5 rules and walk your way through them and ask yourself, you have to memorize the rule first, the 5 rules first. But then to kind of walk yourself through and say, okay, if I see this, am I going to recognize it? Can I see the rules at work? That's the key to not having memorized 330 me verb forms in the me verb chart, okay? All right, so spend some time in this chart. And you go down the present, it's didomi, didos, didosi, didomen, didate, didoasi. Okay, that shouldn't be a problem for you right now. You go to the imperfect and you have the reduplication with the iota and the augment in front of it. Now, if you really have learned your contraction rules properly, then you may see that there's something kind of weird going on in the imperfect active. What is it? How do you get a didun, omicron upsilon? Well, what actually is going on in Greek in the Koine period is that me verbs were being phased out. That's just the nature of language. It changes, right? And for whatever be the reason, the Greeks were deciding they didn't like me verbs anymore, and they were slowly getting rid of them. In fact, you can find some words in biblical Greek that have a me verb and a thematic form. You have histemi and histano. Okay, they 2 different forms, exactly the same word. Histemi is an athematic, and histano is a thematic form. But me verbs were in the process of being phased out of biblical Greek. And what's going on in the imperfect is that you're seeing a hint of that already, because what happens in the imperfect singular is that you actually have a connecting vowel, and they don't use the alternate endings. That's what explains the contractions. But you may just want to memorize that, put it in your exceptions chart, I'm not sure. But that's what's going on in the imperfect. It's a little different. But you go to the plural and everything is normal, no surprises. Go to the future, blissfully regular. Go down the aorist, not a problem at all, except you just have to remember that rule that me verbs use a kappa aorist. And you go to the perfect and absolutely no problems at all. This chart is a very important chart because it shows you how the rules work. And when we get even into the non-indicative of didomi in the next chapter, and then we get into the other kinds of me verbs in the last chapter, it's this chapter that will be the key to everything. So you need to spend a lot of time on it, make sure you understand how the rules are at work, because then you'll be able to easily see the rules at work in the other me verbs, okay? So spend good time on there. Now, before we're done, though, what I'd like to do is just play a game, okay? This is just back to observation. And again, one of the reasons I'm doing this, especially for those of you that have tried to learn Greek in the past and had struggles, you probably struggled with me verbs. And again, what I have found after years of teaching it this way is that I get to the end of the me verb and I'll ask my students, was that hard? They go, no, it's not that big of a deal. So just use the rules and use your powers of observation, and don't be frightened if you've tried to learn Greek in the past. Me verbs just aren't that hard, okay? But let me just show you some forms, and we'll kind of just pull them apart and look at them, and you'll be able to see how easy it is to form them. What if you saw the form dosita? What is that? Well, obviously, these are all going to be didomi because it's the only me verb you know, other than me. But these are all didomi. Okay, so you have the da, you have the root there. It's been lengthened to an omega. You know that the eta is a third plural, so all that you're left with is the sigma. So what is this? It's a second person plural, future active indicative. It can't be anything else, right? Okay, wasn't hard. What if you saw edidus? Well, you look at that and you go, well, there's an epsilon at the beginning. That's some kind of augment. Oh, you have a reduplication within iota. Well, if there's a reduplication within iota, it has to be in the present tense system. Oh, there's an augment. That makes it imperfect, right? And then you have to figure out that us is the second person singular ending. Okay? So edidus is just an imperfect active. No big deal. What about edoka? What's that? Well, you have an epsilon, so you have an augment. You have the da, so you know it's didomi, and you have a kappa, and you may think, oh, it's a perfect, it's got kappa. Wait a minute, there's no reduplication. Oh, it's an augment, that's right. Me verbs use kappa aorist. This has got to be an aorist active. No big deal, right? All right, couple more. What if you saw didosin? Wow, that's easy, isn't it? You got a reduplication within iota. You know you're in the present tense system. You just got to figure out that what sin is, and it's your alternate third singular ending, and so that's what didosin is. All right. One last form. What if you saw dedoka? Well, you have a reduplication with an epsilon. Piece of cake. You're in the perfect, right? Okay, hopefully that was kind of fun, and you can see how, as you just kind of walk through all those things, that it's not that hard. So you know the root of the verb, you know your 5 rules, and you know how to apply them, and they're straightforward. Okay, well, that's it for the indicative of didomi. Let's look at the summary and see what we've learned. Basically, we've learned the 5 rules for me verbs. Rule number 1 is that they reduplicate in the present, and you separate the reduplicated consonant within the iota. Secondly, this is the athematic conjugation, so there's no connecting vowel or thematic vowel added. Thirdly, that me verbs use a different personal endings in the present active only, those 3 endings. Fourthly, you're going to have ablaut, that final vowel of the root's going to change its length. And fifthly, me verbs take a kappa aorist. So there you go, me verbs, at least the indicative of didomi. So let's get on to your vocabulary. Didomi. I give out, entrust, give back, put. Ethnos, ethnus, ta. In the singular, nation. In the plural, the Gentiles. Loipos, loipe, loipon. As an adjective, remaining. As a noun, rest. As an adverb, for the rest, henceforth. Mouzes, mouzeos, ha. Moses. Paradidomi. I entrust, hand over, betray. Pipto. I fall. Huparcho. I am, exist. Well, here you are, almost done with the book. Well, we have chapter 35 and one more chapter after this, so hang in there, you're just about there. In the last chapter, we learned the indicative forms of didomi. And so in this chapter, we're going to learn the non-indicative forms of didomi. I just thought it was too much to cram into one chapter, so I split it out. And in an earlier chapter, we also learned about conditional sentences. And I want to use some time in this chapter to kind of fill out your understanding of conditional sentences. So that's the two things we're going to be looking at in chapter 35. Let's start in the non-indicative forms of didomi with the subjunctive. Take a look at the chart. The column on the left is the present, and the column on the right is the aorist. The first aorist is used in the indicative, but the second aorist everywhere else, and we're not in the indicative here. What do you recognize in these forms? Well, you may be wondering, on the one hand, well, where'd me go? Where'd all the alternate endings go? Well, remember, the me endings, all the alternate endings, belong in the present active indicative, and we're not in the present active indicative, so all those alternate endings have gone away. In fact, what you're going to find is that in the non-indicative, me verbs are phenomenally regular. So one thing you notice is that you don't have those alternate endings. So what else do you notice? Both columns are absolutely identical, aren't they? Except for the reduplication in the present. Yeah, the forms, the way the endings go on to the da is perfectly consistent. And so what you're going to have to do when you see in an inflected form is ask yourself, do I see the reduplication? In other words, am I in the present tense system or am I outside of the present tense system? So these are really straightforward as long as you recognize what's happening. If you look at the middle, there are the same kind of things going on. And you switch into the subjunctive passive, and again, things are very much as you would expect. Perhaps the only little difference is that in the aorist passive, the vowel is short, dotho, and in the present, it's lengthened to the omega, didomai. But that's not a big deal for you because you know that final stem vowel lengthens, and it doesn't really affect your ability to parse the form, okay? So that's the subjunctive, both active and passive. Switch over into the imperative, and you're going to see again the same kind of blissful regularity. Second and third person singular, second and third person plural. Left column is present, right column is the second aorist. And in all of these forms, you have the something tosen pattern, and you just have to memorize the second person singular. But after that, it's regular. One's got the reduplication, one doesn't, right? Didato, dato. Okay, you just got to pay attention to the rules on that. Switch over to the infinitive. Again, same regularity. Didonai in the present active. Didosthai, present middle. Didosthai, present passive. And then in the aorist, it's dunai, dosthai, dothenai. There's a contraction going on in dunai you may want to notice. But other than that, the paradigm is wonderfully, blissfully regular. See, me verbs, instead of being so hard, are actually very, very easy to know. But then there's always the participle. Okay. And in the participle, as you look through these forms, these are the 6 forms in each area you need to memorize. And again, the difference between the present and the aorist is a reduplication. Nothing else, right, in the active. Deduce, dedusa, didon, didontos, deduces, didontos. You go over to the aorist, Same thing, but without the reduplication. Okay, so these things are blissfully regular. And what I would really encourage you to do at this point in time is to spend some time in the paradigms. You really need just to be looking through the charts and asking yourself several questions. One is, can I figure out what's going on? Do I see the patterns? Does it make sense? And secondly, if I saw this form, would I know it without having to memorize the entire chart? Now, only you can answer that question. But you really need just to spend some time looking through all these forms. I think this is where my morphological approach really shines. If you don't take the morphological approach, if you just try to memorize, you got hundreds, literally hundreds and hundreds of forms that you're going to have to memorize. And again, unless you become a Greek teacher, you probably aren't going to be able to keep reviewing all those paradigms. So it's just much easier just to learn the basic rules, identify the root of the verb, and then just be able to figure out what's going to happen and to identify it when you see it. Again, if you don't want to do that, have fun memorizing, but that's not for me. All right. I'm going to tell you a story that I don't know if I've ever told before, but it's part of why I do Greek the way I did it. I had several really good professors in seminary. George Ladd was one of the most influential men in my life, but Bill Lesor also was tremendously influential, and you may not have heard of Dr. Lesor. He was probably the greatest ancient linguist I've ever known. He had written 5, 6, I think it was, inductive grammars, not only Greek and Hebrew, but Akkadian and Ugaritic and stuff. He was an unusual person. One was he always had time for students, which is why I developed a relationship with him, and I'm thankful for that. But he was really smart. He was one of these guys that during World War II was requested, he was in the chaplaincy program, he requested to go to China because he wanted to pick up Chinese. Okay, he wasn't a normal person. When I started developing my approach to teaching Greek, the morphological approach, he had retired by this time, and I took him out for dinner. And I asked him a series of questions that were kind of silly, but I wanted him to say that I thought my approach made sense. And I had some index cards written out and had different inflected forms written on them, perhaps like deduces. Okay. And I said, can you parse this for me? And he smiled and parsed it. And I said, now, how do you know what that is? He said, well, and my word was, there's triggers. I see the reduplication. I see the stem da. I see the participle morpheme. So I know what it is. I said, so your mind doesn't go through paradigms? He goes, no, of course not. I mean, he'd been teaching Greek and Hebrew and everything else for 50 years. And I said, what do you think of an approach to teaching Greek that would start with the triggers, that wouldn't emphasize the paradigms? And we had a very interesting conversation, and he gave me his blessing for what I was doing. It felt kind of funny because I was writing a grammar that was going to compete with his. But it was a really important time in my life as a Greek teacher because I wanted someone whom I respected immensely and who knew a lot more than I'll ever know to say, this makes sense. This morphological approach makes sense. So I just say that in terms of encouragement to you. When you look at the paradigms of the me verbs and the non-indicatives and you're looking at participles, I mean, you can just get overwhelmed with all these forms. But you have it on the highest authority, highest human authority, that if you can just learn the triggers, if you can learn the roots, if you can learn the rules, that's how most of us translate Greek who have been around for a while. So really encourage you just to learn those rules and to get them down, okay? All right. Well, so much for the non-indicative forms of didomy. Let's move on to conditional sentences. Now, we've already learned some things about conditional sentences, so let me cover it by review. Conditional sentences are if-then type sentences, right? And we call the if the protasis, and we call the then the apodosis. For some reason, it always feels like we got them backwards. But anyway, the if is the protasis, and the then is the apodosis. We also saw that only the protasis is conditional. If this is true, then this is going to be the case. So the issue of conditionality applies only to the protasis. And back in chapter 31, we learned the third class conditional sentences, okay? These are conditional sentences where the protasis is introduced with aeon and the verb is in the subjunctive, okay? And I broke it down into two categories. They're identical in form, but there's two basic categories of meaning with a third class conditional sentence. That if you find aeon in the subjunctive, it might be a future more probable condition. And what the construction is saying is that if this is the case, and there's a pretty good case that it is true, then this will happen. But the exactly same construction, aeon plus a subjunctive, can be used to express a present general, a statement that is generally true, almost axiomatic. If this is the case, then this is the case, okay? And it pulls it really out of time and just makes it aphoristic or just general, okay, present general, all right. And we also saw, finally, that conditional sentences are classified by their structural. Third class are words or forms where the protasis is aeon plus the subjunctive. Okay, that was by review. What I'd like to do is to look at first and second class conditional sentences, all right, and get those into our head. First class conditional sentences are also called conditions of fact. And these are if-then constructions where in the protasis you have a and a verb in the indicative. And what you're saying is that if this is the case, and let's assume for the sake of argument that it is, then this is going to be true. Okay, that's a very important qualification. They're saying if this is true, and there's an assumption that the if is true in order to make the logic of the sentence work. Okay, now let me illustrate that. There's two different ways to translate the a in these kinds of construction. Most people just default to if, okay? So for example, Jesus says, if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off, okay? Well, if your right hand causes you to sin, and for the sake of the argument, we're going to assume that's true, then here's what you're supposed to do, okay? But Paul tells the Corinthians that if there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. Well, but if there's no resurrection of the dead, we know that that's not true. So in other words, a first-class conditional sentence can be used where the protasis is not true, but in order for the if-then construction to work, you have to assume that the if clause is true for the sake of the argument, okay? All right. So first-class conditional sentences, conditions of fact, are built on a with the indicative and the protasis. And they're saying, if this is true, and let's assume for the sake of argument it is, may not be, but we need to assume it is for the sake of the argument, then this is true. Okay? All right. The other way to translate the a is with the word since. Sometimes, because the truth of the protasis is assumed in the argument, sometimes if feels a little weird. Okay, I don't know how else to put it. Paul tells the Thessalonians, if we believe that Jesus died. If? Don't we believe that? And there's some discussion in the advanced grammars about this. Some grammars argue that even in this sentence we should say if, because it's a way of making an affirmation. If this is true, and obviously I think it is, some teachers are comfortable, though, with you translating this a as since, okay? Since we believe that Jesus rose from the dead. So check with your teacher. But most people believe that you can translate the a as both if and since if it's needed. The problem is that if you don't use since, then you're adding a nuance of conditionality that's not appropriate. It's like if you said, well, if I believe that Jesus was raised from the dead, someone could say, yeah, but don't you? I thought you did. Okay, that's the kind of situation that since works. But anyway, that's first-class conditional sentences. Okay, second-class conditional sentences. Second-class conditional sentences are also called conditions contrary to fact. And what second-class conditional sentences are saying is that if this is true, and I know it's not, but if it is true, then this would follow. Okay? So the if clause is known to be false, okay? It's not true. And the structure changes a little bit with second-class conditions. In the protasis, you still have a with an indicative verb. But in the apodosis, not always, but normally, you're going to have on, alpha nu, with a secondary tense verb. Okay? So that's the grammatical, the contextual clue that we're not in a first class, but rather we're in a second class conditional sentence. Take, for example, what Paul told the Corinthians. He said, if they had known him, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Okay. If they had known him, well, we know they didn't know him, but if they had known him, then they wouldn't have done this, okay? So there's the contrary to fact. If they had known him, well, we knew they didn't, but if they had known him, all right? So those are your first and second class conditional statements. Let's take a look at this chart. It'll kind of summarize everything and hopefully make it easier for you to keep these things separate. A first class conditional sentence in the protasis has a with the indicative, and it's negated with an u. The verb can be any tense. In the apodosis, the verb can be whatever it wants. A second class conditional statement has a plus the indicative in the protasis. The verb is going to be in the past tense, and it's going to be negated by may. That'd be another clue. But in the apodosis, normally, not always, but normally, you're going to have on and an indicative verb, and that verb actually is going to be in the same tense as the verb that's in the protasis. Then there are third class conditional sentences that we learned back in chapter 31. They're introduced with the aon and the subjunctive. They're negated by may, and the apodosis can be any mood, any tense. And then finally, in the fourth class, and we don't have any examples of a complete fourth class conditional sentence in the New Testament. We have parts of them. We don't have any complete one. But if we did have a complete one, you would have a plus the optative, which is another mood, in the protasis, and in the apodosis you would have on plus the optative. You remember with a third class conditional sentence, you can have a future more probable form, that if this is true, and it probably will be true, then this will happen. Well, the fourth class is the opposite. It's if this is true and it probably isn't, then this might happen. So that's what a fourth class conditional is. But that's just to fill out the chart for you, okay? All right. So, conditional sentences. Let's look in summary then at what we've learned in this chapter. We looked at the non-indicative of didomi, and I just encourage you to spend some time in the charts and take the rules that you know and watch the rules at work in the paradigms. Much easier than memorizing hundreds of new forms. And we also filled out our understanding of conditional sentences. First-class conditional statements, statements of fact, are formed with a in the indicative in their protasis. It's assumed to be true for the sake of the argument. Second-class conditional sentences are contrary to fact statements. They are a plus the indicative in the protasis and probably will have on in the apodosis. And there's third-class conditional sentences, which are aon plus a subjunctive in the protasis, and they can be future more probable or present general. Same form for both. Well, that's it for chapter 35, and we only have one more chapter to go and we're done, so that's good news. Congratulations. But there is one oddity here in the vocabulary section. I didn't have any words to show you. In other words, by the time you learn the words in chapter 36, with those you already know, that's all the words that occur 50 times or more in the Greek Testament. So I didn't have any words to give you, and maybe you don't want to learn anymore, and check with your teacher. But I thought I'd use this opportunity not just to give you a few more words, but to give you some fun words. And so the vocabulary in chapter 35 are important theological terms that occur less than 50 times. At least most of them are theological. So if you need to learn them, I would encourage you to do it, because you're going to need them anyway pretty soon once you get into your next year of Greek. But let me go through the vocabulary with you, and then check with your teacher whether you need to know them or not, okay? Hagiadzo. Hagiadzo means I consecrate, sanctify. Hamartano. Hamartano means I sin. Hamartolos. Hamartolos. As an adjective, it means sinful. As a noun, it means sinner. Anastasis. Anastasis means resurrection. Apangelo. Apangelo means I report, tell. Diakoneo. Diakoneo, I serve. Diakonia. Diakonia, hey, means service. Dikaiao. Dikaiao means I justify, vindicate. Thlipsis. Thlipsis, hey, means affliction, tribulation. Hilasterion. Hilasterion, ta, means propitiation, expiation, place of propitiation. Staurao. Staurao, I crucify. Soter. Soter, ha, means Savior, Deliverer. Soteria. Soteria, hey, means salvation, deliverance. Phanerao. Phanerao, I reveal, make known. Phobos. Phobos, ha, fear, reverence. Can you believe you made it all the way to the end? Welcome to chapter 36. I'm sure there was times that some of you felt you were never going to make it, but you did. So congratulations on getting to the end of the book. There's a couple things I want to cover in this chapter. We're going to finish our understanding of me verbs. Now, don't let this scare you. If you've been learning the rules in conjunction with ditto me, most of this chapter is just a review because you're going to see that the rules carry through to the other kinds of me verbs. So don't worry about it. But we're going to look at the rest of the kinds of me verbs. We're going to look a little bit at the article. I've given you bits and pieces of the grammar pertaining to Hoth through the different chapters, and I thought I needed to pull it together before we end the book. And there's a few other odds and ends I'm going to cover. So there's not a ton in this chapter. So, me verbs. In the last two chapters, we talked about me verbs whose roots end in an omicron. And I gave you the rules that controlled the formation of me verbs. Now, those rules affect not only other roots ending in omicron, but those rules affect all the different forms of the me verbs, okay? So what's true of ditto me is going to be true of the other me verbs, regardless of the final stem vowel. And so it's really important that you notice that. But there are omicron class me verbs like ditto me. But there's three others, okay? There's an alpha class of me verbs, stems ending in alpha, and I'm going to be using sta as an example. There are epsilon class me verbs whose stems end in epsilon, and I'm going to be using the as an example. And there's one root that ends in an upsilon. It's dake nu, and so I'll be talking about that as well. Let's take a look at the actual chart here. You notice I put ditto me as a third column, and it's ditto me, dittos, ditto si with the new movable, didomen, didite, didoasi, again with the new movable. Now, what you can see there are all the rules at work, can't you? You've got the reduplication with the initial delta iota. You have the final stem vowel, long in the singular, short in the plural. You have a few alternate endings and a few regular endings. So everything there is what you've already learned. Go over to the right to the dake nu column because dake nu me is a weird word and it's the easiest one to learn. What's going on in Greek is that the me conjugation was going away and it was being replaced by the thematic conjugation. And now, don't you wish the me verb conjugation had gone away before the time of the Bible? You wouldn't have to know these forms. But again, they're not that hard, so it's no big deal. But dake nu me is already starting to shift over to the thematic conjugation. You can see it in the second person singular, right? The ending is ace, not just the sigma. And you can also see it in that there's no reduplication. So dake nu me, while it's technically a me verb, is halfway over into the thematic conjugation. So just take a look at that, and this shouldn't give you any problems at all. It's the two columns on the left, though, that are important, and I want to talk my way through them. The far left column is with the lexical form histemi, and the root is sta. Now, you may look at that and you go, that's really weird. How does sta goes to histemi? Oh, histemi must be a really irregular word. Well, it's not, okay? And there's two ways to handle it. One is that you can just memorize it. You can just memorize the present tense stem as histemi with the root is sta. And if you know that, everything else is regular. It's no big deal. Now, if you want to know what did happen, this is what happened. You had this root sta. It reduplicated to sista, but Greeks don't like that initial sigma when it's there because it was reduplicated, so it's dropped out and replaced with a rough breathing. So sta goes to sista, goes to ista, goes to hista, all right? Now, you can learn that if you want, or you can just learn that histemi is from the root sta, and after that it's perfectly regular. Take a look at the forms. It's histemi, histes, histesi, and then just like the omega goes to an omicron with didomi, the eta goes to an alpha, and you get histamin, histate, histasi. Perfectly regular, isn't it? Okay, go to the next column. The lexical form is tithemi, and the root is the. Now, how did that happen? Well, again, you have the same possibilities. You can just memorize it. Just memorize the lexical form tithemi, means I put or place, and you can memorize that it's from the root the. And that after that is all going to be absolutely regular. Now, if you want to know what happened, it did reduplicate normally, and you got thitha, but theta is what's called an aspirate, and Greeks don't like two aspirates, or they don't like two syllables in a row to start with aspirates, and so the reduplicated theta is deaspirated to a tau, all right? So the goes to thitha, goes to titha, okay? So other than that oddity, everything else here is perfectly regular. And again, if that's too much for you to learn, just memorize tithemi, and it's from the root the. So take a look at the forms. You get tithemi, tithes, tithesi, and then you have to shorten that final stem vowel, and you get tithemin, tithete, titheasi. So take a look at that chart, and it's really regular, isn't it? Once you know the rules. I'm not going to take the time to show you all the other non-indicative paradigms for histemi and for tithemi, but I would encourage you to spend some time in the appendix of BBG and just start looking through the charts. And again, do what I've encouraged you to do all along. Look at the forms and ask yourself, do I see the rules at work? Would I recognize this particular form if I saw it in context? If you think there's going to have a real problem, you may want to mark it, maybe highlight in the book or something. But I think for the most part, you're going to be able to, if you know the rules, you're going to be able to identify these different inflected forms. So congratulations, that's it for me verbs. That wasn't too hard, was it? All right. Now, before we end the chapter, I want to pull together your understanding of the article. I've done lots of little bits and pieces in helping you understand the article, but I want to take this opportunity in the last chapter to kind of pull it all together, because the article is actually quite important. Now, it's often a nuanced kind of thing. It's more second and third year grammar than first, but I've shown you lots of different bits and pieces of it, so let's pull it together. Basically, I've said, if the article is present, translate it. If it's not present, then don't say the in your translation. And there were a few exceptions, like proper names. But for the most part, you've been translating the article if it's present, and you've not been saying the if it's not. I would encourage you at some point in time to work through Dan Wallace's grammar, his Greek grammar beyond the basics. Dan loves the article. And again, it can be a bit overwhelming, but there's a lot of good information in Dan's grammar on the article. So don't do it right now, but eventually you're going to want to look at his grammar. In terms of the primary function of the article, its primary function is not to make a word definite. Now, that's what the article does in English. But Greek nouns inherently have a degree of definiteness already about them. I mean, they don't need the article to be the in English. That's not what ha is doing in Greek. That's not its primary function. That's why it flexes so much in its meaning when we bring it into English. But what is its primary function? Well, let me explain it to you based on whether the article is present or whether the article is not present in the text, okay? So let's start with those situations where the article is present. What is the article stressing? Well, if I could give you one word, it's the word identity. The article is about identity. When it's present, it's stressing the identity of the noun. Now, this breaks down into lots of different subcategories, and there's some detail about them in the grammar, but let me just hit some of them for you now. One of the functions of the word ha in Greek is as an anaphoric. Anaphoric just simply means that it's pointing backwards. In other words, you'll see an article, and it may or may not make much sense in this particular verse if you just think of ha in terms of the. But what it's really doing is pointing you back to something else. For example, in 2 Timothy 4:2, Paul tells Timothy to preach the word. Well, I mean, that kind of makes sense in English. But what the article there is really doing is saying, preach the word, namely the word that I've been talking about for the last half chapter, back to the middle part of chapter 3. In other words, it's preach the word, and it's ton logon. But what the ton is doing is it's anaphoric. It's pointing you back to the previous discussion. Now, how do I know that? Well, language is both science and art, right? And you're working on the science of language in this part of your journey towards Greek. But as you do Greek more and more, you start to develop a feel for it, and you start developing a feel especially for the article. In other words, it's all nuance, it's all context. The article doesn't change its shape when it's anaphoric. It's you just to develop a feel for these things. And it may not be real apparent in this verse, but it'll be more apparent in other verses. But anyway, that's what an anaphoric is. It's the use of the article to say, hey, the word that I'm modifying is referring back to something that I've already talked about. So anaphoric. Sometimes the article is used in a way that comes into English only as a pronoun. And for example, sometimes you're going to be using the demonstrative pronoun to translate the article. In Matthew 14:15, it says the disciples came to Jesus and said, this place is desolate. Well, the Greek is hatapos. The place is definite, but that doesn't make any sense. Well, this is where the article, the word ha is moving into the semantic range of the English demonstrative pronoun. And so you will have the flexibility to translate the article as a demonstrative. But you'll also have the flexibility to translate ha as a personal pronoun, or a possessive, or even a relative, and we've looked at those already. Another use of the article, and again, this is all determined by context, is called the use of the article par excellence. And what the article is doing here is saying, this is a primary example. This is the most excellent example, as it were, of this. So they say to Jesus in John 1:21, are you the prophet? Are you the prophet par excellence? Are you the one that was promised by Moses? In other words. So just another use of the article. There's another use of the article called the monadic. And this is very close to the previous example. And what the article is doing is saying that the word that the article is modifying is a one of a kind. It's unique. John says, behold, the Lamb of God. Is the adding definiteness, identity to lamb? Yeah, but it's saying more than that. It's saying this is the Lamb of God, the only Lamb of God. Now the question is, again, how would you know it's monadic if it's all context? This is all context, okay? And so that's why a lot of this discussion is normally handled in second year. But it's fun to introduce it now and to kind of give you a taste for what it is. And finally, the article often is used just as a grammatical marker. It's turning things into substantives like prepositional phrases. Or sometimes in the article noun article modifier construction, it is indicating that the following word is a modifier to the previous. So in other words, sometimes the article is just indicating grammar of some sort. So those are some of the different ways that the word ha is translated when it's present. Now, what happens when ha is not present? What's going on in the grammatical system in the Greek language when there is a noun and there isn't an article in front of it? Well, while the presence of the article is stressing identity, when the article is not present, what's being emphasized is the quality of the noun. And again, this is a nuanced thing. It'll be a little hard to get a hold of, but you'll see it if you start paying attention to it. It's somewhat the same thing that happens in English when we put a in front of something. Think of the woman in John 4. Now, I said the woman. Why did I say the woman? Well, because it's a woman that you know. You know her story. See, the is stressing the identity of woman. But when you read it in John 4, The text says, a woman of Samaria came to the well. See, at the beginning of the story, before you know the story, the stress isn't on any particular woman. It's on the fact that it was a woman. And it was a woman talking to a man. It was a Samaritan woman talking to a Jewish man. It was a woman who comes to the well in the heat of the day. And, you probably know the story. See, because gune is anarthrous in John 4, it's not that it was that particular woman, but it was a woman. And everything that culturally is tied up with that, okay? So, in terms of the article, when it's present, it's stressing identity. When it's not present, the quality of the noun is being stressed. And from that point, it's just an issue of exegesis and developing a feel for the language, okay? All right. Well, that's all that I really wanted to say on the article. But it should give you a good feel as to what's coming up especially in second year Greek. Okay. Few other odds and ends, and these are things that I could have talked about in almost any chapter, but I realized that I never actually formally talked about these things, and so I want to cover them before the book is done. The first has to do with verbs, okay? Verbs break down into one of two categories. They're either transitive or they're intransitive. Now, a transitive verb is a verb whose action moves from the verb and it crosses over to the direct object, okay? And so a transitive verb is a verb that has to have a direct object to make any sense. The action of the verb crosses over. If you know your Latin, you'll see the preposition at work. A transitive verb has action that moves over to a direct object. An intransitive verb is a verb whose action does not necessarily move over to a direct object. In other words, you can have a verb that if it's intransitive, it's not going to have a direct object, and that's perfectly okay. So if you say, bring him here to me, bring him. See, bring is the verb, it's an imperative in this case, but it's a transitive verb, and so you need an object, so it's bring him. Okay. But if you said, he rose up and followed Jesus. Okay, he rose up. There's no direct object for rose up, is there? Well, it's because it's an intransitive verb. All right? So verbs are either transitive or intransitive. In fact, some are both, but I'll let you find that out when you get to that. Okay, one more thing, sentence structure. There actually is a normal Greek sentence structure. It's varied so much it probably doesn't feel like it's normal. But there is a normal, and the normal is verb, subject, object. Okay? Verb, subject, object. The problem is that because Greek's inflected, that normal order is just changed all over the place. And when the normal word order is being changed, it's normally to emphasize something. Now again, this emphasis is very slight, it's very gentle, it's very nuanced. And often you can't put a whole lot of exegetical weight on words being out of normal order, okay? But when they do change the normal word order, there's usually some kind of nuanced emphasis going on. Now, sometimes what happens is that something gets moved to the front. And in fact, apparently, if you really wanted to emphasize something, it tended to move to the front of the sentence, which would make sense, right? And sometimes we can do this in English. The best example is Ephesians 2. For by grace you have been saved, okay? And so English can handle a change of normal word order for emphasis when stuff goes to the front. And that's pretty dramatic even in Greek. In other words, when you see something really out of order because it's in the front of the sentence, there's probably some emphasis going on. But at a very nuanced level, if you move things out of, again, normal, I keep putting quote marks around that, but if you move words out of their normal word order, there's a little bit of emphasis going on. I still remember when I was in graduate school reading commentaries that said, well, this word is in an emphatic position. Well, this word's an emphatic position, and it looked like they could put the words anywhere in the sentence, and the author would say it's an emphatic position. And I went to a senior seminar and asked Professor Marshall, my supervisor, about what was going on with this stuff. In fact, several of the other students joined in because they had been seeing the same things in their studies. And he kind of laughed and he said, well, basically, all you have to do is change the order and the commentaries will say it's emphatic. All right. Well, again, very nuanced, very gentle. But the normal order is verb, subject, object. If you really want to emphasize something, you can push it to the front of the sentence. And if you want to have a little bit of nuanced emphasis, you just move it somewhere else, it seems, in the sentence. But again, very, very nuanced, so be careful with that, okay? Okay, well, guess what? You're done with the grammar. Can you believe it? All right. Well, let's summarize what we learned in this chapter. We can now see that there are 4 categories of me verbs. We learned the omicron category, like da. And in this chapter, we learned deiknumi, which is technically an upsilon category of me verbs, even though it doesn't look much like a me verb. But then we also learned alpha me verbs, sta, going to histemi, and then regular from there on. And we learned epsilon me verbs like the, that goes to tithemi, and is very regular from there on. And we looked just briefly at the nuances of the article. When it's present, it's emphasizing identity of some sort, or it's just a grammatical marker. When it's absent, the quality of the noun is being stressed. And we said verbs are either transitive or intransitive, and we talked a bit about word order. Okay, there's some vocabulary to learn in this chapter, but I want you to look at a graph. If you learn the extra vocabulary in chapter 35, you just barely are going to go over the 80% marker. Congratulations! That means with all the words that you know at the end of this chapter, that you know 8 out of 10, 4 out of 5 of every word occurrences in the entire Bible. Now, when you get into second year Greek, you'll start chipping away at that remaining 20%. You'll need to do that. But for right now, you know 80%, and that's really, really good. Anistemi. As an intransitive verb, I rise, get up. As a transitive verb, I raise. Anoigo. I open. Afiemi. I let go, leave, permit, forgive. Deiknumi. I show, explain. Idios, idea, idion. One's own. Histemi. As an intransitive verb, I stand. As a transitive verb, I cause to stand. Mesos, messe, meson. Middle, in the midst. Tithemi. I put, place. Phemi. I say, affirm. So congratulations, and I really mean that, congratulations. For most people, learning Greek is a task. It's something that takes a lot of effort, a lot of work, and in a few cases, a few tears, and a lot of frustration. I understand that, but I'm hoping that by the time you've gotten here to the end, that you've learned how to learn the language, and you're getting all these building blocks, the foundation of the language under your belt. And you're ready to launch out into the text and to get to know Scripture better and better. So congratulations. I'm sure you've put in the effort. One of the questions that I'm asked a lot is, what's next? How do I keep up what I've learned? How do I fine-tune what I've learned? What's next? And there's a discussion in the grammar of this, but it's important enough that I wanted to spend some time here and encourage you to do several different things in your studies. There are 2 additional chapters in the workbook. One is of the entire book of 2 John, which is only 1 chapter, and the other is Mark 2:1 through 3:6. In fact, a lot of the illustrations that I chose in the workbook are drawn from the first couple chapters of Mark, so you'll recognize a lot of it. These chapters are here to encourage you, and I'm hoping there's time left in your studies before finals to really work through these chapters, because there's nothing new to learn in these 2 chapters. They're just fun. And you've done all this hard work and done all the building blocks, And it's time to enjoy yourself. And so I wanted to give you 2 chapters where you could really just enjoy what you've learned. And when you're done, you have the joy of saying, hey, I've translated an entire Bible of the entire book of the Bible in Greek. That'd be 2 John, 20 some verses, but hey, it's a whole book, right? So I'd really encourage you, even if there isn't time left in your semester, if you're in school, and really encourage you to do those too. Secondly, I'd really encourage you to pick up another book I wrote called A Graded Reader. I realized, and this is many years ago, that the way we used to learn English was with graded readers. And there was a first-year graded reader and a second-year graded reader, and they got progressively harder. But there wasn't anything like that in Greek. There used to be some ones in Latin, but I couldn't find anything in Greek. Perhaps there was. I didn't come across them. So I wrote the graded reader, and I think it's 20 chapters, and it starts out with easier stuff, and it gets harder and harder. It goes from Gospels to Paul, and even a couple of passages from outside of the Greek Testament. There are questions in there to help you start thinking exegetically about, okay, now that I know this is an aorist, what does that mean? What is its significance? Or is there any real significance or not? That kind of stuff. In the next edition, which I'm starting to work on, which, depending on when you're looking at this video, it may or may not be out, is I'm going to do a lot more work with vocabulary and really help you chip away at that final 20%. But what the graded reader is a chance for me to, in essence, sit down with you, because there's all kinds of helpful notes in there, things that will, if you get stuck, I'm going to try to explain, at least maybe not giving you the complete answer, but pointing you in the right direction so you can have the joy of learning. But it's basically me sitting down with you in the book and saying, okay, let's work through a whole chapter together or several large paragraphs together. So I'd really encourage you to get a copy of the graded reader and just spend some time actually applying all these building blocks that you have learned to exegesis. I encourage you to spend time in the Greek text. The old adage is, 1 or 2 verses a day keeps the senility away. At least it's my adage. And there's some truth in that. And along with that, if you're going to go take a class in Romans, force yourself to read a commentary that requires you to know Greek. Okay, just put yourself in a situation where you have to use the Greek. And what will happen, and this is for all of us, this is how we really learned our Greek. You can't just sit down and learn it all out of a textbook. You have to use it. And so if you can take a class in Romans, read a Greek-based commentary. Do some of your reading in the Greek text. Ask your teacher about the Greek instructions, that kind of stuff. But the whole trick is just to keep using this language on a regular basis. I'm also blogging every Monday. It's called Monday with Mounce. And the blog comes up several places, but it's at billmounce.com. And what I do is just I pick some little point of Greek grammar, some exegetical point where knowing Greek will help you understand the Bible better. And it's just a way to kind of help you keep using your Greek and to be reminded why you learned all this stuff. It's important to keep reviewing. And by the time you watch this, my mini grammar will be out. And it's just a little 200-page grammar that you can carry. It's the size of your Greek Bible. You can carry it with your Bible. And it's a good way just to kind of review the charts and to review the rules, your vocabulary, review grammar and that kind of stuff. So I encourage you to pick that up. At some point in time, if you're serious about biblical studies, there's 2 books you have to buy. The first is a Greek lexicon, and we're lucky there's only one that's you really need to get, and that's the one by Bauer. It's currently by Bauer, Danker, Art, and Gingrich. That's the current edition of it. And it's an expensive book, and I'm sorry about that, but it is an unbelievable resource, and you don't want to try to work in Greek without a really good dictionary. So you're going to need to get that, and that's the one to get. If you're really tight on money, you can buy one of the earlier editions, and while they're not quite as good, they're still very, very good, okay? You also need to pick up Dan Wallace's Greek grammar. It's called Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics. Now, there's a 40-page summary of Dan's work in the graded reader, and so you can kind of get an introduction to grammar. Second year graded reader, but at some point in time, you need to pick up Dan's grammar. Now, not a lot of people know this, but I'll tell you another anecdote like I did the other lesson. Dan and I are actually very, very old friends. Our parents were friends before we were born. Rumor has it that his mom has a picture of Dan and me playing in a sandbox when we were both 2 years old. I really want that picture. I've not been able to get it yet. But Dan and I have been friends since we've been very, very little kids. And I was delighted when he submitted his intermediate grammar to Zondervan for publication, because it really is good. And it's pretty much become the standard second year reference grammar. You really need to get it. And there's a huge, great big thick version, and then he made a slightly smaller one. But this is what you're going to be using for the rest of your life if you're going to be in biblical studies, and so you need a really good grammar. So you get the introduction to it in my graded reader, and then I encourage you to pick up his grammar. If you, like me, always want to know exactly why words do what they do in terms of their paradigms, you can also pick up a book of mine called The Morphology of Biblical Greek. I reference it quite a bit in the grammar. This is the book that started everything for me. And it's the end of the series, but I wrote it first because I had to make sure I understood morphology, the square stops and all that kind of stuff. But this book should have everything you could ever possibly want to know about the forms of Greek words. And it's the theoretical basis of everything that I've written in Greek. So it's out there, and you can get a copy of that as well. But in terms of what do you do next, I think the final thing, and I want to end with this, the final thing is you just have to keep reminding yourself, why did you do this? Why did you learn Greek? Well, maybe it was a requirement in school and you had to, but hopefully it was more than that, because you could have picked another language, probably. But you picked Greek. And you need to remind yourself why. And I know at times when it gets hard, it's tempting to forget why. But you need to remind yourself why. God's word in the New Testament has come to us in Greek. Regardless of what language Jesus may or may not have spoken, the New Testament has come to us in Greek. And it was the language that God, in his sovereign control of human events, so determined to be the conveyor of this part of his revelation, of his character, and of his will. And it is going to be one of the primary tools that you use for your entire life. Now, if you're headed to the pastorate or something like that, there's going to be all sorts of things clamoring for your time. Your time, you'd be counseling, or your administrative responsibilities, or working with the staff, and all these kinds of things. But your ability to know the Word of God at a deeper level, and your ability to understand the character and the will and the mind of God, and your ability to be able to express that to others. If you're headed to any kind of teaching or preaching ministry, this is absolutely paramount, because you cannot stand before God's people and say, "Thus saith the Lord," if you're not sure what the words mean. And we have great English translations, and they help us a lot, but ultimately, I really believe that if you want to stand before your people and say, "Thus saith the Lord," and you're in the New Testament, you really need to know Greek. You need to have a working knowledge of the language, because while translations are good, they do over-translate, they do under-translate, and you need to know for yourself. And you need, even if it turns out you're wrong, you need to have the confidence that you've done your homework and you've come to a point where you're comfortable saying, "Thus saith the Lord." And in the New Testament, you really need to know Greek to do that. So that is what's next for you. And I'd really encourage you to work hard at the reviewing and the using of the language. Believe it or not, eventually, this language will become second nature to you. I've been doing this, since college. And I get stuck on vocabulary sometimes. I get stuck on some weird grammar at times. But it's become almost second nature to me now. And it's just because I've used it, and I've used it, and I've used it. And then I got to teach it, which solidified it. But it's just, I can't imagine preaching or teaching without having access to the text. So my encouragement to you is, you've got the building blocks now. All right, there's going to be a lot of fine-tuning that goes on in second year, a lot of fine-tuning in Dan's grammar. But it's fine-tuning. You've got the building blocks now. Okay, you've done the bulk of the work. Now it's time to go out and use it and enjoy it. So I hope that these lectures have helped you in reaching this particular goal. And I look forward to seeing you. I get lots of emails from people that have used these tapes and lectures in all their different forms. And it's always encouraging to hear that I've helped you in your ministry, and you're helping me in mine by encouraging me. But if not, we'll see you in heaven. And look me up when you get there, okay? All right. Thank you very much.